Chapter 1. The Stolen Dragon. The storm that raged over Dragonstone on the night of 284 AC would be remembered not for its fury, but for what it carried away into the darkness. As the ancient seat of House Targaryen groaned under winds that seemed to herald the very end of the world, two small figures huddled in the bowels of a fishing vessel, a ship never meant for such desperate cargo. Sir Willem Darry clutched the crying infant to his chest with hands that shook from more than the cold. The babe was perhaps 3 moons old, silver-gold hair already marking her as unmistakably Targaryen, her violet eyes wide, with an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for such a small face. Beside him, young Viserys pressed against his side, the boy's own violet eyes hollow with the weight of loss no 8-year-old should bear. "She won't stop crying," Viserys whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Why won't she stop?" "She knows," Darry replied, adjusting his grip on little Daenerys. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandages wrapped around his sword arm, a parting gift from Stannis Baratheon's men before their escape. She knows her world has ended. But the storm that was supposed to carry them to safety in the free cities had other plans. The fishing vessel, already straining under conditions far beyond its capabilities, began to take on water faster than the crew could bail. Through the darkness ahead, the lights of White Harbor gleamed like false promises of sanctuary. "My lord," called the ship's captain, his weathered face grim. "We'll not make the open sea in this gale. We must make port, or we'll all be feeding the fish before dawn." Darry's jaw tightened. White Harbor meant Lord Wyman Manderley, and Manderley meant the North, Robert Baratheon's North now, but death by drowning would serve no one, least of all the last hope of House Targaryen that lay crying in his arms. "Do it," he said. The harbor was chaos when they limped into port. Other ships had sought refuge from the storm, and in the confusion of damaged vessels and panicked crews, 3 more refugees might pass unnoticed. Darry pulled his cloak closer around the infant and kept Viserys pressed to his side as they made their way through the harbor. They almost made it. "Sir Willem Darry." The voice cut through the storm like a blade. Stannis Baratheon stood at the end of the pier, flanked by a dozen of his men-at-arms. His face was harder than the stone of Dragonstone, his eyes like chips of flint. "I thought that was you on the water." Darry's hand moved instinctively to his sword, then stopped. The wound in his arm had weakened him, and he could feel the fever beginning to set in. Against 12 healthy men, with 2 children to protect, there could be no victory, only negotiation. "Lord Stannis," he said carefully, "the storm forced our hand." "Indeed." Stannis stepped closer, his gaze moving from Darry to the bundle in his arms to young Viserys. "Robert would have my head if he knew I'd let Targaryen spawn slip through my fingers. But then, Robert has always been more interested in wine and women than the practicalities of ruling." There was something in Stannis's tone, not mercy exactly, but perhaps pragmatism. Darry seized the opening. "You want the gold?" he said. "The treasure that fled Dragonstone before your brother's men could claim it. I know where it's hidden." Stannis's eyes sharpened. "All of it? Enough to fund a 12 campaigns, or to buy a 12 fleets." Darry shifted Daenerys to his other arm, wincing as the movement sent fresh fire through his wound. "But I'll only deal with a man who keeps his word." The negotiation was swift and brutal. Stannis cared nothing for Targaryen blood. To him, they were simply problems to be managed. The gold was real and substantial, hidden in caches across the narrow sea that Darry had helped establish during the war's chaotic final months. In exchange for the locations, Stannis would ensure the children reached safety beyond Robert's reach. But the Storm had one final play to make. As they prepared to depart White Harbor on one of Stannis's ships, a massive wave crashed against the harbor wall, sending debris flying. A broken mast struck Viserys as the boy stood near the water's edge, and in the chaos that followed, screaming, shouting, men diving into the churning water, young Viserys Targaryen vanished into the black depths of the harbor. They searched for hours. Darry refused to leave until Stannis threatened to take the infant and go without him. When dawn finally broke grey and cold over White Harbor, there was no sign of the boy who had been the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. "The sea keeps its secrets," Stannis said, watching Darry hold the now silent infant as she stared out over the water with those impossibly violet eyes. "Perhaps it's for the best. The boy would have been nothing but trouble." Lord Wyman Manderley was not pleased to have Stannis Baratheon demanding hospitality at dawn, especially not with a wounded man and a mysterious infant in tow. But Manderley was a practical man, and when Stannis took him aside for a quiet word, the Lord of White Harbor's expression grew thoughtful. "This is dangerous business, my lord," Manderley said, glancing at where Darry sat slumped against a wall, the infant cradled against his chest. "To harbour such guests could be seen as treason." "Which is why they're not staying," Stannis replied. "But they need time. The man is dying, look at him, and arrangements must be made for the child." Manderley studied the silver-haired infant with calculating eyes. "What arrangements?" "That," Stannis said, "is not your concern. But Lord Stark might find this information useful." The message that rode north to Winterfell was brief and written in Manderley's own hand. "Ned, urgent matter requires your immediate discretion. A gift that might interest you, given your recent circumstances. Time is short. Trust no one else with this knowledge. Wyman." When Eddard Stark arrived at White Harbor 3 days later, riding hard with only a handful of trusted men, Sir Willem Darry was already deep in fever dreams. The infant, however, seemed almost to be waiting for him. She lay quietly in the simple wooden cradle the castle's servants had provided, her violet eyes tracking movement with an awareness that made Ned's blood run cold. "She's—" Ned began, then stopped. There were no words for what she was. The last daughter of the Mad King, sister to the prince who had started the war that killed his father and brother. And yet, as he looked down at her, all he could see was another child who would grow up without parents, another innocent marked by the sins of adults. "Sir Willem spoke before the fever took him fully," Manderley said quietly. "He wanted you to know. She's no threat to Robert. She's just a babe who needs a home." Ned thought of Jon Snow, waiting for him at Winterfell, another child with royal blood, another secret that could topple kingdoms if revealed. The parallels were too stark to ignore. 2 children born in the shadow of war, both carrying bloodlines that could see them killed if discovered. "What did you tell your men about her?" Ned asked. "That she's a war orphan from the Stormlands. Her parents died in the fighting near Summerhall." Manderley's expression was carefully neutral. "No one has looked too closely. Silver hair isn't unknown in the South." Ned picked up the infant, surprised by how naturally she settled against his chest. She looked up at him with those impossibly violet eyes, and for a moment he could swear she understood the weight of the decision he was making. "Then she's my daughter," he said quietly. "A bastard born during the war, like Jon. The realm needs no more Targaryen princes or princesses, but it can always use another Snow." When Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell a week later, he carried 2 bundles in his arms. "Jon Snow," the bastard son the realm expected, and Dana Snow, the bastard daughter no one had known existed. To the world, they would be twins, born to different mothers during the chaos of war, but both acknowledged by their honorable father. Only Ned would know that one carried the blood of the last Targaryen princess, and the other the blood of the last Targaryen prince. Only he would know that in accepting both children, he had made himself guardian to the two most dangerous secrets in the Seven Kingdoms. As he walked through the gates of Winterfell with his wife Catelyn beside him, her face a mask of barely concealed shock at finding herself mother to two bastards instead of one, Ned Stark wondered if he had just saved two innocent children, or doomed them both. In his arms, baby Dana Snow opened her violet eyes and looked up at the grey walls of Winterfell, as if she were coming home to a place she had always known she would find. And perhaps, in the way of children who carry the blood of dragons, she was. Chapter 2. 2 Wolves in Winter. 5 years had passed since the night Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell carrying 2 infants in his arms, and the castle had grown accustomed to the sight of Jon and Dana Snow racing through its corridors like a pair of wolf pups born from the same litter. To all who knew them, they were twins in all but birth, inseparable, fierce, and marked by the peculiar understanding that comes to children who share the weight of being different. On this particular morning in 289 AC, the early autumn air bit sharp through the courtyard as Jon and Dana huddled behind the stables, their breath coming in small white puffs as they whispered their plans for the day. At 5 years old, they had already mastered the art of avoiding Septa Mordane's lessons and Catelyn's watchful gaze, finding refuge in the forgotten corners of Winterfell, where bastard children might play without constant reminders of their place. Old Nan says there are secret passages in the oldest part of the castle, Jon whispered, his dark eyes bright with excitement. His resemblance to Ned grew stronger each year, the long face, the grey eyes, the solemn expression that seemed too old for a child. Behind the sept, she says they lead all the way to the crypts. Dana's violet eyes, always carefully explained away as a rare gift from her mysterious mother, sparkled with an eagerness that went beyond childhood curiosity. Where Jon moved with careful precision, Dana seemed to burn with an inner fire that made her hair catch the light like spun silver, and her skin seemed to glow even in Winterfell's perpetual grey. "The crypts," she repeated, and there was something in her voice, a hunger that neither child could name. "Where the old kings sleep." "Where our father's father sleeps," Jon corrected, though he had noticed how Dana always spoke of the ancient Starks as if they were strangers rather than family. It was one of many small differences between them that others attributed to her having different mothers, but which troubled Jon in ways he couldn't express. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of footsteps, and both children pressed closer to the stable wall as voices carried across the courtyard. Catelyn Stark walked with purpose toward the great hall, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she spoke, in low, urgent tones, to Sir Rodrik Castle. "The girl grows stranger each day," Catelyn was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "Yesterday I found her in the kitchen, sitting so close to the great hearth that the heat should have burned her. But when I pulled her away, her dress wasn't even singed, and the cook swears the girl was laughing at the flames as if they were speaking to her." Sir Rodrik, weathered and practical, stroked his grey whiskers thoughtfully. "Children have strange fancies, my lady. And bastard children, well, they often invent games to entertain themselves." "It's not games, Rodrik." Catelyn's voice dropped lower, but the children's hiding place was close enough that her words carried clearly. "She speaks in her sleep, words I don't recognize. foreign words, and her eyes. Sometimes when she looks at me, it's as if she's seeing something else, entirely. Something that frightens her. Dana's hand found John's, her small fingers cold despite the morning warmth. She had been having the dreams again. Visions of great beasts with wings like night and fire that poured from their mouths like golden rivers. In the dreams, she rode on the back of something vast and powerful, soaring over lands that looked nothing like the north. And sometimes, in those dreams, she heard voices calling her by a name that wasn't Dana, a name that felt like coming home and losing everything at the same time. Lord Stark knows of these peculiarities? Sir Roderick asked. He sees them, Catelyn replied, and there was something almost bitter in her tone. But he says only that she is his daughter, and that we must love her as such. As if love alone could explain why a 5-year-old child shows no fear of fire, or why she seems to understand the words of every foreign trader who passes through Winterfell's gates. The voices faded as the adults moved away. But Dana remained pressed against the stable wall, her heart hammering in her chest. She had always known she was different. The dreams alone were proof of that. But hearing it spoken aloud by the woman she desperately wanted to call mother made the knowledge taste like ash in her mouth. Dana. John's voice was soft, careful. At 5 years old, he already possessed the Stark instinct for recognizing pain and the northern way of addressing it, directly, but with gentleness. You're not really strange. You're just special. Special, Dana repeated, testing the word. Like how Robb is special because he's the heir. Or how Sansa is special because she's so pretty. John considered this with the seriousness that marked all his thoughts. Different special, he said finally. Like how some people can sing and others can't. Or how old Nan knows stories that no one else remembers. As if summoned by her name, old Nan's voice carried across the courtyard, calling for her charges. The ancient woman had been at Winterfell longer than anyone could remember, her mind a repository of northern history and legend that she dispensed to any child willing to listen. Dana and John had become her most devoted audience, particularly when her stories turned to the old days, to the time of magic and monsters and kings who wore crowns of winter roses. They found her in her accustomed chair by the great hall's massive hearth, her gnarled hands working at an endless piece of embroidery, while young Robb Stark sat at her feet, his auburn hair marking him unmistakably as Catelyn's son. At 6, Robb already carried himself with the confidence of a future lord, but he made room for his bastard siblings without hesitation when they approached. "Ah, there you are, my little wolves," old Nan said, her clouded eyes somehow finding them despite her near blindness. "I was just telling young Robb about the dragon lords of old Valyria. Perhaps you'd like to hear." Dana settled beside Robb with an eagerness that bordered on desperation, while John took his usual place slightly apart, close enough to listen, far enough to remember his place. It was a positioning that spoke to the careful hierarchy of Winterfell, where bastards might be loved, but never forgotten. "The Dragon Lords," old Nan continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of ancient tale-telling, "were beautiful and terrible, with hair like spun silver and eyes like jewels. They commanded beasts that could melt stone with their breath and flew like eagles on wings that blotted out the sun. But they were proud, oh so proud, and their pride brought fire and blood to the world." Dana hung on every word, her small hands clenched in her lap as images from her dreams rose unbidden in her mind. She could see them, the great winged shadows, the cities burning like candles in the night, the screams that echoed across water and stone. And always, always, the sense that she was watching something that belonged to her, something that had been taken away. "What happened to them?" Robb asked, though he had heard this story many times before. "Doom," old Nan said simply. "The doom of Valyria took them all, dragons and riders alike, consumed by fire and shadow, until nothing remained but ruins and whispers, all except for one family who had left Valyria before the end. They came to Westeros with their dragons and conquered the Seven Kingdoms, ruling for 300 years until the Mad King," Jon finished quietly. Even at 5, the children of Winterfell knew the recent history, how King Aerys had burned men alive, how he had killed Lord Rickard and Brandon Stark, how Robert Baratheon had won the throne in righteous rebellion. "Until pride brought them low again," old Nan corrected. "Dragons or no dragons, fire burns all who think themselves above the natural order." That night, as the castle settled into sleep, Dana lay in the small chamber she shared with Jon, staring at the ceiling, while her supposed twin breathed deeply beside her. The dreams were coming more frequently now, and with them a growing sense that the stories old Nan told were not merely stories. They were memories, calling to something in her blood that recognized truth in the tales of fire and flight. She had almost drifted off when she heard the soft sound of her door opening. A figure moved quietly into the room, too large to be Jon, too careful to be a servant. Dana kept her breathing steady, watching through half-closed eyes as Ned Stark approached her bed. Her father, for despite everything, that's what he was, stood looking down at her for a long moment, his face grave in the moonlight streaming through the narrow window. She had inherited nothing from him, this man who claimed her as his own. Where he was dark, she was light. Where his eyes were grey as winter storms, hers were purple as summer twilights. And yet, in the way he looked at her, she could see the same protective love he showed to all his children. "I know you're awake, little one," Ned said softly, settling onto the edge of her bed with careful precision. "You breathe differently when you dream." Dana opened her eyes fully, meeting his gaze with the direct honesty that was perhaps the one truly Stark trait she had managed to develop. "The dreams are getting stronger, Papa. Tell me," he said simply. And so she did, in whispered words that barely disturbed Jon's sleep. She told him about the great winged shadows and the burning cities, about the sense of flying and the voices that called her by names she didn't understand. She told him about the feeling that came with the dreams, not fear exactly, but recognition, as if she was remembering rather than imagining. When she finished, Ned was quiet for a long time, his hand resting gently on her silver-gold hair. Finally, he spoke. "Some people are born with gifts, Dana. Gifts that others might not understand or might fear. Your dreams. They may be one such gift." His voice was careful, measured, as if each word was being weighed for its potential consequences. But gifts can be dangerous if they're not properly understood. "Do you understand me?" Dana nodded solemnly. Even at 5, she could sense the gravity in his words, the warning wrapped in love. "I need you to promise me something," Ned continued. "These dreams, these feelings you have, they must be our secret, yours and mine. Not even Jon can know. Not yet. Can you promise me that?" "I promise, Papa," Dana whispered, though the weight of the secret felt heavy in her chest. Ned leaned down and kissed her forehead, his beard scratching gently against her skin. "You are my daughter," he said firmly. "Whatever else you might be, whatever else you might become, You are a daughter of Winterfell, and daughters of Winterfell are stronger than their dreams." But as her father left the room and Dana finally drifted toward sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that her dreams were not something to be overcome, but something to be embraced. And in the deepest part of her heart, in a place where the blood of dragons still ran hot and fierce, she knew that someday she would have to choose between being Dana Snow, bastard daughter of Winterfell, and whatever else she truly was. The choice, she sensed even then, would change everything. Chapter 3. The Dragon's Education. The Heart Tree's ancient face seemed to watch with knowing eyes as Eddard Stark led his bastard daughter deeper into the Godswood than any of his other children had ever been permitted to go. It was early morning in the autumn of 291 AC, and at 7 years old, Dana Snow had grown into a child whose beauty was becoming impossible to ignore, and equally impossible to explain. Her silver-gold hair caught the filtered sunlight like spun moonbeams, and her violet eyes held an intelligence that seemed to burn with its own inner fire. She moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly, as if she were dancing to music only she could hear. To those who knew how to look, the signs of her true heritage were written in every line of her small frame, which was precisely why Ned had begun bringing her to this secluded corner of the Godswood, far from curious eyes and listening ears. "Today we begin a different sort of lesson," Ned said, settling onto a fallen log while Dana perched beside him with the careful attention she gave to everything her father said. "History lessons that are important for any highborn person to know, particularly one who might need to understand the world beyond Winterfell." Dana tilted her head, a gesture that reminded Ned painfully of another silver-haired child he had known briefly, Viserys Targaryen, in the few moments before he had vanished into White Harbor's dark waters. "What kind of history, Papa?" "The history of dragons," Ned said quietly, watching her reaction carefully. "And the people who rode them." The change in Dana was immediate and startling. Her violet eyes widened, and she seemed to lean forward without moving, as if every fiber of her being had suddenly focused on his words with laser intensity. "Real dragons? Not just old Nan's stories?" "Very real," Ned confirmed. "For 3 centuries, the Targaryen kings ruled the 7 kingdoms with the power of dragons. They came from old Valyria, a great empire across the narrow sea that was destroyed in a cataclysm called the Doom. Only one family escaped, the Targaryens, who had already come to Westeros with their dragons." As he spoke, Ned watched Dana's face transform. The polite attention of a dutiful daughter gave way to something far more intense, a hunger for knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere curiosity. She absorbed every word as if it were water, and she had been dying of thirst. "What happened to them?" she asked, though Ned suspected she already knew pieces of the answer from her dreams. "They ruled wisely for the most part. Aegon the Conqueror united the 7 kingdoms under one crown. His descendants built a dynasty that lasted 300 years. Ned's voice grew heavier. But in the end, power without restraint corrupted them. The last Targaryen king was called Aerys II. History will remember him as the Mad King. Dana was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful deliberation that marked all her thoughts. Finally, she looked up at her father with those impossible violet eyes. "Is that why you're telling me this? Because knowing about bad kings makes you a better person?" The perceptiveness of the question caught Ned off guard, as Dana's insights so often did. At 7, she possessed an understanding of political nuance that most adults never achieved. "Partly," he admitted, but also because the blood of dragons doesn't simply disappear from the world when the dragons die. Understanding that heritage, its power and its dangers, is important for anyone who might carry it. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that Dana was too young to fully grasp, but old enough to sense. She studied her father's face with the intensity she brought to all her most important questions. "Papa," she said carefully, "am I carrying that heritage?" Ned looked into the violet eyes of the last Targaryen princess and made a choice that would shape both their destinies. "Yes," he said simply, "and that is why you must learn to be stronger than your blood, wiser than your ancestors, and more careful than your dreams might tell you to be." The lessons that followed were unlike any education given to other children of Winterfell. 3 times a week, Ned would bring Dana to the secluded heart of the Godswood, where ancient Valyrian phrases mingled with lessons about governance, justice, and the terrible weight of power. He taught her the genealogy of House Targaryen, as thoroughly as he taught his true-born children the lineage of House Stark, but with a crucial difference. These lessons came with warnings. Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, Ned would say, using historical examples to illustrate the complexities of inheritance and power. The realm bled for 50 years because of that decision. Remember, noble intentions can have terrible consequences if they are not coupled with wisdom. Dana proved to be a remarkable student. Languages came to her as naturally as breathing, and when Ned tentatively introduced her to simple phrases in High Valyrian, she picked up the pronunciation with an ease that was almost supernatural. Within weeks, she was constructing basic sentences in the ancient language of dragons, her young voice lending the harsh syllables a musicality that made them sound like poetry. Maester Luwin noticed her linguistic gifts during her regular lessons with Jon and 8-year-old Robb. The old scholar had been puzzled by Dana's abilities from the time she was old enough to begin formal education, but her mastery of High Valyrian left him almost speechless. "It's remarkable," he confided to Ned, after one particularly astounding lesson, where Dana had translated a complex passage from a Braavosi trading contract without hesitation. "I've never seen a child, or an adult for that matter, grasp the nuances of High Valyrian so quickly. It's as if she already knows the language and is simply remembering it." Ned kept his expression carefully neutral. "She's always been quick with words. Perhaps she has a natural ear for languages." "Perhaps," Luwin agreed, though his tone suggested he suspected there was more to it. "I've been thinking we might want to expand her education. Introduce her to the histories of Essos, perhaps some basic diplomacy. If she continues to show this aptitude, she could be quite useful as a translator when foreign dignitaries visit." The suggestion filled Ned with both pride and terror. Dana's gifts were undeniable, but every display of her unusual abilities brought new risks. Still, he could hardly stunt her intellectual growth out of caution. "We'll see," he said finally. "For now, let's focus on ensuring she has a solid foundation in Westerosi history and law." It was during this period of intensive education that Dana's physical training also began in earnest. Sir Roderick Castle had been reluctant to include a girl, bastard or not, in the weapons training he provided to Robb and Jon. But Ned's insistence had overridden the old knight's traditional views. "The North is a dangerous place," Ned had explained. "All my children, all of them, should know how to defend themselves." Dana threw herself into the training with the same intensity she brought to her linguistic studies. Where Jon was methodical and Robb was naturally gifted, Dana was fierce, wielding her practice sword with a fluid grace that seemed almost like dancing. She moved as if she could anticipate her opponent's actions, flowing around their attacks with an economy of motion that spoke of instincts honed by something deeper than mere training. But it was when Ser Roderick introduced the children to horsemanship that Anna's true nature began to show most clearly. The moment she approached the stable, every horse in Winterfell seemed to sense her presence. They turned toward her with an alertness that bordered on reverence, as if recognizing something in her scent or bearing that marked her as different from other humans. "Well, I'll be damned," Ser Roderick muttered, as a particularly spirited young stallion, one that had thrown 2 experienced riders the week before, gentled immediately under Dana's touch. "I've never seen anything like it." Dana swung herself onto the horse's back with natural ease, and from the first moment, it was clear that she had been born to ride. She didn't simply sit the horse, she became one with it, moving in perfect harmony with its gait, as if they shared a single mind. Within an hour, she was riding as well as Jon and Robb, who had been learning for months. "She has a gift," Ser Roderick told Ned later, shaking his grey head in amazement. "I've trained knights who couldn't command a horse the way that little girl does. It's almost as if they understand her better than they understand us." That night, as had become their custom, Ned found Dana in the Godswood after the castle had settled into sleep. She sat beneath the heart tree with 1-year-old Bran in her lap, singing softly in what sounded like High Valyrian, while the infant gurgled contentedly in her arms. "What are you singing?" Ned asked, settling beside them. "A lullaby," Dana said simply. "I think I remember it from before, from when I was very small." Ned felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn. "Before when?" Dana was quiet for a moment, her violet eyes distant. "I don't know exactly. Sometimes I remember things that feel like they happened to someone else. A woman with silver hair singing this song. A man with kind eyes who called me little princess." She looked up at Ned with sudden intensity. "But that can't be right, can it? Because I've always been here. I've always been yours." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Ned felt his heart break for this child who carried the weight of 2 identities without fully understanding either one. He reached out and pulled both Dana and baby Bran closer, holding them against the growing cold. "You are mine," he said firmly. "Whatever you remember, whoever you might have been, you are Dana Snow, daughter of Eddard Stark. That is not a lie or a convenience. That is the truth that matters." But even as he spoke the words, Ned could see in Dana's violet eyes that she was beginning to sense the larger truths that lay beneath his comforting assurances. She was too intelligent, too intuitive, and growing too powerful to remain ignorant of her heritage much longer. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. For in educating Dana Snow, he was not simply raising a bastard daughter, he was preparing the last daughter of House Targaryen for a destiny that could either save the realm or burn it to ash. And with each passing day, as her gifts grew stronger and her understanding deeper, Ned found himself wondering which it would be. Later that week, as autumn deepened toward winter, Dana and Jon made their first expedition into the deepest parts of Winterfell's crypts. They had convinced themselves it was an adventure, a game of exploration to add excitement to the increasingly cold days. But as they descended into the ancient depths where the oldest Stark kings lay entombed, Dana felt a pull that had nothing to do with childhood curiosity. The deeper they went, the stronger the sensation became. It was as if something in the very stones of Winterfell was calling to her, not welcoming her exactly, but acknowledging her presence. The crypts felt different to her than they did to Jon, who moved through them with the reverent caution of a child exploring his family's sacred spaces. To Dana they felt like a puzzle she was meant to solve, a message written in stone and shadow that was waiting for her to develop the wisdom to read it. "Do you feel that?" she whispered to John as they stood before the tomb of Brandon the Builder, founder of their house. "Feel what?" John asked, though his voice was hushed in the way that sacred places demanded. Dana pressed her hand against the cold stone, and for just a moment she could swear she felt something stir beneath her palm. Not movement exactly, but recognition, as if the ancient stones remembered other hands that had touched them, other voices that had spoken their secrets in the darkness. "Nothing," she said finally, pulling her hand away. But as they climbed back toward the light, Dana carried with her the growing certainty that Winterfell held secrets that went deeper than even Ned Stark knew, and that someday, when she was ready, those secrets would call to the dragon blood that ran in her veins and demand their due. The education of Dana Snow had only just begun. Chapter 4. Smoke and Mirrors. The kitchen fire started as they always did in Winterfell's great castle, with grease spitting from an overfilled pan and catching the edge of a hanging cloth. But what should have been a minor mishap, requiring only quick action and a bucket of water instead, became the moment when Dana Snow's carefully hidden nature finally betrayed itself in a way that could not be ignored or explained away. It was early winter in 293 AC, and 9-year-old Dana had been helping in the kitchens, as all of Ned Stark's children were taught to do. The Lord of Winterfell believed that understanding every aspect of running a household, from the Great Hall to the servants' quarters, was essential education for those who might someday rule. Even bastards, in Ned's view, should know the value of honest work. The cook, a stout woman named Gage, who had served House Stark for 30 years, had been tending to the evening's roast when the accident occurred. A pot of rendered fat caught flame and spread faster than anyone could react, racing along the wooden preparation table toward where young Dana stood, frozen in the rapidly expanding circle of fire. "Get back!" Gage screamed, reaching for the girl even as the flames roared higher, but Dana didn't move. She stood, transfixed in the heart of the blaze, her violet eyes wide, not with fear, but with something that looked almost like recognition. The fire swept around her small frame, engulfing her completely in a column of orange and gold that should have reduced her to ash in moments. When the flames finally died down, smothered by the bucket brigade that had formed among the servants, they expected to find tragedy. Instead, they found Dana Snow standing exactly where she had been, her dress unmarked, her silver-gold hair unsinged, her pale skin showing no trace of burns. She looked around at the circle of shocked faces, with the bewildered expression of a child who couldn't understand why everyone was staring. "I'm all right," she said simply, her young voice cutting through the stunned silence. "The fire. It didn't hurt me." Word of the incident spread through Winterfell like wildfire itself. By the time Ned returned from the Wolf's Wood, where he had been hunting with Robb and John, the entire castle was buzzing with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed. He found Catelyn waiting for him in their solar, her blue eyes blazing with an anger that had been building for 9 long years. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, closing the door behind him with deliberate force. "About Dana. About what she really is." Ned had been dreading this conversation since the day he brought home 2 infants and claimed them both as his own. He moved to pour himself wine with careful, measured movements, buying time to choose his words. "She's my daughter. Our daughter. What more is there to discuss?" "Don't!" Catelyn's voice cut like a blade. "Don't lie to me anymore, Ned. I've watched that girl for 9 years, watched her grow stranger with each passing season, and today," she gestured helplessly, "today she stood in the middle of a kitchen fire and walked away unharmed. That's not natural. That's not human." "She's perfectly human," Ned replied, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Is she?" Catelyn stepped closer, her face flushed with years of suppressed frustration. "Look at her, Ned. Really look at her. The silver hair, the violet eyes, the way animals respond to her, the way she speaks languages she's never been taught. And now this. Immunity to fire itself. Those aren't the traits of a bastard born to some southern woman during the war." Ned turned away from his wife's penetrating stare, but Catelyn was relentless. "I know what those traits are," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than a shout. "Every child in Westeros learns the stories. Silver gold hair, violet eyes, and an unnatural relationship with fire. Those are the markers of House Targaryen. That little girl isn't your bastard daughter, Ned. She's a dragon." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth, a fire that suddenly seemed to mock them both with its ordinary, contained flames. Ned felt the weight of 9 years of careful lies pressing down on him, and for a moment he considered telling Catelyn everything. But the risk was too great, not just to Dana, but to Jon as well, and to his own family's safety. "You're overwrought," he said finally. The fire was frightening and, "Don't you dare dismiss me!" Catelyn's composure finally cracked completely. "I've been a good wife to you, Ned Stark. I've raised your bastard as if she were my own blood, loved her despite the pain it caused me to see you care for her with such obvious devotion. But I won't be made a fool of in my own home." Unknown to either parent, 2 small figures huddled outside the solar door, pressed against the stone wall, with the wide-eyed attention that only children brought to adult conversations they weren't supposed to hear. Jon and Dana had been looking for Ned to tell him about their day's adventures when they heard their names being spoken in voices tight with anger. "But if she's not really your daughter," Catelyn was saying, "then what is she? And why would you risk everything, our family, our honor, our lives, to protect her?" Dana's small hand found Jon's, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the corridor. She had always known she was different, had always sensed that there were truths about her birth that no one spoke aloud. But hearing it discussed so directly, with such fear and anger, made those half-formed suspicions crystallize into something harder and more frightening. "We're not really twins," she whispered to Jon, her violet eyes bright with unshed tears. Jon squeezed her hand tighter, his dark grey eyes fierce with a protectiveness that went far beyond his 9 years. "It doesn't matter," he whispered back. "You're still my sister. You're still part of this family." But even as he spoke the words, Jon felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of the world. If Dana wasn't his twin, wasn't even Ned's daughter, then who was she? And why did the adults speak of her with such careful fear? Inside the solar, Ned had moved to stand by the window, his shoulders heavy with the burden of secrets that grew heavier each year. "What would you have me do, Cat? Cast out a 9-year-old girl because she's different? Send her away because her blood frightens you?" "I want the truth," Catelyn said simply. "All of it. What is she, Ned? Where did she come from? And what does keeping her here cost us?" Before Ned could answer, a commotion erupted from elsewhere in the castle. Shouts of alarm, running footsteps, and the sound of Maester Luwin's voice calling for assistance. Both parents rushed from the solar, their argument forgotten in the face of what sounded like a genuine emergency. They found chaos in the great hall, where little Bran, barely 3 years old, lay unconscious on the stone floor. He had been playing near the massive fireplace, building castles with wooden blocks, when a log had shifted, and sent a cascade of sparks and burning embers tumbling out onto the hearth. In trying to protect his toys, the boy had been caught by falling cinder and knocked unconscious by a piece of burning wood. "He's breathing," Maester Lewin reported tersely as he knelt beside the small form. "But he's taken a blow to the head. There may be burns as well. I need to examine him properly in my chambers." As the adults organized the transfer of the injured child, Dana slipped away from the crowd and approached the spot where Bran lay. She could see the angry red marks on his small hands where embers had touched his skin, could sense something wrong in the way he lay so still and pale. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, she knelt beside him and placed her hands over the burns. The warmth that flowed from her palms was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not the cold fire of her dreams or the strange immunity she felt around flames, but something deeper and more purposeful. She could feel the heat drawing the pain from Bran's injuries, could sense his small body responding to her touch with a healing that went beyond anything natural. "Dana!" Ned's sharp voice cut through her concentration, and she looked up to find him staring at her with an expression of horror and warning. "Step away from your brother. Now." But it was too late. Several people had witnessed what she was doing, had seen the red marks on Bran's hands fade to pink and then to normal skin tone under her touch. Maester Lewin was staring at her with undisguised fascination and a growing understanding that made Ned's blood run cold. "Remarkable," the Maester murmured, his scholarly mind already racing ahead to implications and possibilities. "I've read of such abilities in the ancient texts, but I never thought to see—" "You saw nothing," Ned said sharply, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. The boy's injuries were minor, superficial burns that looked worse than they were. Is that understood? Maester Lewin's eyes met his lord's for a long moment, and in that gaze was the understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge openly. "Of course, my lord," he said carefully. "Children's injuries often appear more serious than they prove to be upon examination." That night, after Bran had been declared fully recovered, and the household had settled into an uneasy calm, Ned found Dana in her chamber, sitting by the window and staring out at the winter stars. Jon sat beside her, his presence a silent statement of loyalty that warmed Ned's heart, even as it worried him. "We need to talk," Ned said, closing the door behind him. Dana turned to face him, and in her violet eyes he saw a knowledge that was far too old for her 9 years. "I'm not really your daughter, am I?" she asked, with the directness that had always marked her character. Ned sat heavily on the edge of her bed, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "You are my daughter," he said firmly. "In every way that matters, you are my child, and I love you as such. But you're right. You weren't born to me." "Then who was I born to?" Dana's voice was steady, but Jon could see her hands trembling in her lap. "To people who are gone," Ned said carefully. "To a family that was destroyed in the war. I took you in to protect you, to give you a safe home and a chance at a normal life." "But I'm not normal," Dana said, and there was pain in her voice that made Ned's chest tighten. "I see things in my dreams. I can touch fire without burning. I can do things that other people can't do. Which is exactly why you must be more careful than any other child in Westeros," Ned said urgently. "Dana, listen to me. Your gifts, your differences, they could be seen as threats by people who fear what they don't understand. If the wrong people learned about your abilities, they'd try to hurt her," Jon finished, his young voice hard with understanding. "Like they hurt the other Targaryens. The name hung in the air between them, finally spoken aloud after 9 years of careful silence. Dana's eyes widened as pieces of the puzzle she'd been assembling for years suddenly clicked into place. "I'm a Targaryen," she whispered. "That's why I dream of dragons. That's why I understand High Valyrian without learning it. That's why you must never speak of these things outside this room," Ned interrupted sharply. "Dana, I need you to promise me, swear to me on your love for this family, that you will keep these abilities hidden. No matter what happens, no matter how much you want to help or how safe it seems, you cannot let anyone else see what you can do." Dana looked from Ned to Jon, seeing in both their faces the fear and love that would define the rest of her childhood. She was 9 years old, but she understood with crystalline clarity that her very existence was a danger to everyone she cared about. "I promise," she said solemnly. "I'll hide what I am." "And I'll help her," Jon added fiercely. "Whatever it takes, I'll help keep her safe." Ned looked at these 2 children, one carrying the blood of the last Targaryen prince, the other the last Targaryen princess, and felt the weight of destinies that were far too large for young shoulders to bear. But in their eyes, he also saw the strength that had built Winterfell, the loyalty that had sustained House Stark through 8,000 years of winter. Perhaps it would be enough. That same night, as Dana finally drifted toward sleep, her dreams were filled with visions more vivid and terrible than any she had experienced before. She saw King's Landing burning, its great towers collapsing in rivers of dragonfire. She saw armies clashing beneath banners she recognized from her history lessons. And above it all, she saw dragons, great winged shadows that blotted out the sun as they rained death from the sky. But most disturbing of all, she saw a young man with silver gold hair like her own and violet eyes that burned with madness and rage. He stood atop a hill overlooking a burning city, and when he turned to look at her, she could see in his face an echo of her own features. "Sister," the figure said, though his lips didn't move in the dream, "I have been looking for you for so long. Soon, very soon, we will be reunited, and the world will burn for what they did to our family." Dana woke with a gasp, her heart racing and the taste of ash in her mouth. She looked around her familiar chamber, at Jon sleeping peacefully in the bed beside hers, at the warm furs and tapestries that spoke of safety and love, and tried to convince herself that it had only been a nightmare. But deep in her bones, in the place where dragon blood ran hot and true, she knew that somewhere beyond the narrow sea, the brother she had thought dead was very much alive. And he was coming for her. The game of smoke and mirrors that had protected her for 9 years was beginning to crack, and Dana Snow was about to discover that keeping secrets was far more dangerous than revealing them. Chapter 5. The King in Winterfell. The royal progress that arrived at Winterfell in the late summer of 298 AC brought with it all the pageantry and chaos that followed Robert Baratheon wherever he went. Banners snapped in the northern wind, the crowned stag of Baratheon, the lion of Lannister, and dozens of lesser houses that had attached themselves to the king's journey north. But for 14-year-old Dana Snow, watching from the servants' entrance, as the procession rolled through Winterfell's gates, the sight brought only a cold dread that settled in her stomach like a stone. She had grown into a young woman whose beauty was impossible to ignore and equally impossible to explain away. Her silver-gold hair caught sunlight like spun starlight, and her violet eyes held depths that seemed far older than her years. At 14, she moved with a grace that spoke of hidden fire, and her voice carried the musical quality of High Valyrian even when she spoke the common tongue. To anyone who knew the histories, she was unmistakably what she was, the last daughter of the Dragon Kings, which was precisely why she and John had been assigned to serve in the kitchens during the royal visit, hidden away from curious eyes and dangerous questions. "Keep your head down," John murmured, as they carried flagons of wine toward the great hall. At 14, he had grown tall and lean, his resemblance to Ned more pronounced with each passing year. But where Ned's face spoke of quiet strength, John's bore the harder edges that came from understanding too much about the world's dangers. "Don't let anyone look too closely." Dana nodded, adjusting the simple servant's dress that felt foreign after years of being treated as a lord's daughter, bastard or not. She could hear the sounds of the feast echoing from the great hall, laughter, music, and the booming voice of King Robert regaling the assembly with tales of past glories. But beneath the celebration, she sensed currents of tension and political maneuvering that made her skin prickle with unease. "I still don't understand why we can't just stay in our chambers," she whispered as they approached the serving entrance. "Because that would raise questions," John replied, his grey eyes scanning the corridor for anyone who might overhear. "Bastards don't hide from kings, Dana. They serve and keep quiet and hope not to be noticed." The wisdom of this strategy became apparent within the first hour of the feast. As Dana moved through the great hall, refilling cups and clearing plates, she caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Should have hunted down every last one of them," Robert was saying, his voice loud with wine and old anger. "Targaryen spawn, wherever they might be hiding. The realm will never be safe while dragon blood runs free in the world." "My king," Ned's voice, carefully diplomatic. "The children were innocents. Surely." "Innocents?" Robert's fist crashed down on the table, making several nobles jump. "You didn't see what their father did, Ned. You didn't watch him burn men alive for his pleasure. Dragon blood is poison. It corrupts everything it touches. I'd kill 1,000 dragon children to prevent another mad king." Dana's hands trembled as she poured wine, some of it splashing onto the table as Robert's words hit her like physical blows. Here was the man who had ordered the deaths of children like herself, speaking with casual certainty about murdering anyone who shared her bloodline, and she was standing not 3 feet from him, close enough that he could reach out and snap her neck if he knew what she truly was. "The Targaryen line is ended," Queen Cersei said, her green eyes bright with wine and malice. "The last of them died in exile across the narrow sea. The realm has nothing to fear from ghosts and legends." "Good riddance," Robert muttered, reaching for another cup. "Though I sometimes wonder, if any of them did survive, what would they look like now? The stories say they all had that unnatural beauty. Silver hair, purple eyes, like something out of a fairy tale." Dana froze, the wine flagon heavy in her hands, as she felt Robert's gaze sweep across the servants moving through the hall. For a terrifying moment, their eyes met, and she saw his expression shift from drunken joviality to something sharper and more focused. "You there, girl?" Robert called, his voice cutting through the noise of the feast. "Come here." Every instinct screamed at Dana to run, but training and desperation kept her feet moving forward until she stood before the king's table. She kept her eyes downcast, praying that her hair appeared brown in the torchlight, that her eyes might seem grey rather than violet. "Look at me," Robert commanded, and Dana had no choice but to raise her head. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Robert studied her face with the intensity of a hunter examining fresh tracks, his dark eyes moving from her hair to her eyes, to the delicate structure of her features. Dana could feel Ned's tension from across the table, could sense Jon hovering near the servants' entrance, ready to create a distraction if necessary. "You remind me of someone," Robert said finally, his voice thoughtful in a way that made Dana's heart race. "There's something about your face. Familiar. What's your name, girl?" "Dana Snow, your grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Snow," Robert repeated, and his gaze shifted to Ned with something that might have been approval. "One of yours, then, Stark? You always did have a weakness for pretty women." Ned's smile was carefully neutral. "She's a good girl, works hard in the kitchens." For another long moment, Robert continued to stare at Dana, and she could see him struggling with some half-formed memory or recognition. Then Cersei leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and the moment shattered as the king threw back his head and laughed. "Aye, well, pretty bastards are the best kind," he said with crude humor. "See that she stays useful, Ned. A girl like that could cause trouble if she's not kept busy." Dana curtsied and retreated as quickly as she dared, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She had come within a breath of discovery, of having the most dangerous man in Westeros recognize her for what she was. Only luck and Robert's wine-dulled wits had saved her, but her reprieve was short-lived. As the feast wound down and the guests began to retire to their chambers, Dana found herself assigned to carry furs to the royal quarters. It was there, passing by an open window that overlooked the Gotswood, that she heard voices she recognized. Ned and Robert, walking among the ancient trees. She pressed herself against the stone wall, hidden in shadow, and listened as the two old friends spoke with the frankness that wine and privacy allowed. "I need you, Ned," Robert was saying, his voice heavy with burdens that kingship had placed on his shoulders. "The realm is falling apart, and I don't know who I can trust anymore. Come south with me. Be my hand." "Robert, Ned began, but the king cut him off. "I know what you're going to say. That you belong in the north, that you're not suited for court politics. But that's exactly why I need you. You're the only man I know who puts honor above ambition." They paused directly below Dana's window, and she could see them clearly in the moonlight. Two middle-aged men carrying the weight of a kingdom between them. "There are things you don't know," Ned said carefully. "Responsibilities I can't abandon." "You're bastards," Robert's voice held a note of understanding. "Bring them. The capital could use some northern honesty, and Jon's old enough to start learning about the world. As for the girl..." He paused, and Dana held her breath. "There's something about her, Ned. Something that bothers me. She looks like her mother," Ned said quickly. "The resemblance has grown stronger as she's aged." "Aye, perhaps that's it," Robert mused, though he sounded unconvinced. "Still, keep an eye on that one. Beauty like that draws attention, and not all of it welcome." As the two men moved away, Dana slumped against the wall, her mind reeling from what she had heard. The king wanted Ned to come south, to bring his family to the capital, the most dangerous place in the Seven Kingdoms for anyone carrying Targaryen blood. And worse, Robert's suspicions about her identity were clearly growing stronger, wine or no wine. The next morning brought fresh horrors in the form of Queen Cersei's attention. The Queen had requested a private audience with Lady Catelyn to discuss matters of mutual interest, and Dana found herself serving wine while the two women circled each other with the careful politeness of deadly enemies. "Your husband's bastards are quite striking," Cersei observed, her green eyes studying Dana with predatory interest. "Particularly the girl. Such unusual coloring." "Northern blood can produce surprising variations," Catelyn replied stiffly, though Dana could hear the strain in her voice. "Indeed," Cersei smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I've been thinking about marriage alliances lately. The girl is of age, isn't she? 14? There are several lords who might find her appealing, despite her birth. The casual way Cersei spoke of disposing of her life sent ice through Daena's veins. Here was another danger she had never considered, that her very existence as a beautiful bastard made her a pawn in political games she barely understood. Daena is still very young, Catelyn said carefully. Lord Stark prefers to wait before making such decisions. Of course, Cersei's smile grew sharper. Though one wonders what a man like Ned Stark was thinking, acknowledging such children. Most lords are more discreet about their indiscretions. That evening, as Winterfell finally began to quiet after days of royal chaos, Daena found herself in the Godswood, sitting beneath the heart tree, where she had learned so many dangerous truths about herself. She wasn't surprised when Ned found her there. Their most important conversations always seemed to happen in this ancient place. "We need to talk," he said, settling beside her on the fallen log that had become their traditional meeting place. "About the king's offer," Daena said. It wasn't a question. Ned nodded grimly. "Robert wants me to come to King's Landing, as his hand. And he wants us to come with you." Daena's voice was steady, but Ned could see the fear in her violet eyes. "Jon and me. I can't leave you here," Ned said simply. "Not with Robert's suspicions growing. But taking you south." He shook his head. "It's like walking into a dragon's den." Daena was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Then she turned to face the man who had raised her, protected her, loved her as his own child, and asked the question that had been burning in her heart for years. "Tell me about my real father," she said. "Not the stories, not the careful lessons about Targaryen history. Tell me about the man who was my father." Ned's face grew grave, and for a moment Daena thought he might refuse to answer. But perhaps the events of the past few days had convinced him that half-truths were no longer sufficient. "His name was Aerys Targaryen," Ned said finally. "The second of his name. They called him the Mad King, and by the end, the name fit. But he wasn't always mad, Daena. In his youth, he was different, intelligent, passionate, capable of great kindness. The madness came later, brought on by isolation and paranoia, and the weight of power no man should wield alone. And my mother," Daena's voice was barely a whisper, Queen Rhaella. She was a good woman, caught in a terrible situation. She died bringing you into this world during a storm that raged over Dragonstone. Her last act was to name you Daenerys, Lady of Light in the old tongue. The name hit Daena like a physical blow. Daenerys, not Daena Snow, bastard of Winterfell, but Daenerys Targaryen, princess of a fallen dynasty. The weight of that identity, of everything it meant and everything it cost, settled on her shoulders like a mantle made of fire and shadow. "Daenerys," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt right in a way that Daena never had, like coming home to a place she had always known she belonged. "That name died the night you came to Winterfell," Ned said firmly. "You are Daena Snow. You are my daughter. Whatever blood runs in your veins, whatever destiny might have been yours in another life, you belong here. You belong to this family." But even as he spoke, they both knew that belonging and safety were not the same thing. The royal visit had made clear that Daena's very existence was a threat to the peace Robert Baratheon had built on the bones of her family. Every day she remained hidden was another roll of the dice, another chance for discovery and death. "What are we going to do?" Daena asked. "I don't know," Ned admitted, and the honesty in his voice was somehow more frightening than any lie could have been. "But whatever happens, I want you to remember this. You are not your father. You are not your blood. You are the choices you make and the person you choose to be." As they sat in the God's Wood, surrounded by the watching eyes of carved gods and the whisper of wind through ancient leaves, neither could know that their time for choices was running short. Forces were already in motion that would tear apart the careful web of secrets that had protected Dana for 14 years, and soon she would have to decide whether to remain hidden or step forward and claim the legacy that burned in her dragon's blood. The Game of Thrones was beginning, and ready or not, Daenerys Targaryen was already a player. Chapter 6. The Broken Chain. The morning Ned Stark departed Winterfell for King's Landing, the first snow of winter began to fall. Dana Snow stood at her chamber window, watching as the party assembled in the courtyard below. Her father mounted on his destrier, 12-year-old Sansa, radiant with excitement at the prospect of court life, and 9-year-old Arya sulking behind her scepter, with the rebellion that would define her character. The sight should have filled Dana with the normal sadness of family separation, but instead she felt only a growing dread that settled in her bones like winter cold. In the fortnight since Robert's departure, the dynamics of Winterfell had shifted in ways that made Dana's position increasingly precarious. Without Ned's protective presence, she found herself subject to Catelyn's cold disapproval in ways that had been carefully managed before. The Lady of Winterfell was not cruel. She was too honorable for open cruelty, but her politeness had become as sharp as a blade, cutting away at Dana's sense of belonging with each carefully measured word. "You'll be expected to take on additional duties while Lord Stark is away," Catelyn had informed her the previous evening, her blue eyes holding none of the warmth they showed to her true-born children. "The household cannot afford to support those who don't contribute." The message was clear. Without Ned's protection, Dana was no longer a lord's daughter, but simply another mouth to feed, another bastard to be managed. The realization that her entire life had been balanced on one man's goodwill was a lesson in powerlessness that cut deeper than any physical wound. Jon found her still standing at the window, an hour after the party had disappeared beyond the gates. At 14, he had grown into his role as Dana's protector, with the quiet intensity that marked everything he did. But even he seemed subdued by the weight of recent events. "Father will return," he said, though his grey eyes held doubts he couldn't voice. "And when he does, things will go back to the way they were." Dana turned from the window, and Jon was struck by how much older she looked than her 14 years. The innocent girl who had once chased him through Winterfell's corridors had been replaced by someone who understood too well the fragility of safety and the cost of being different. "Will they?" Dana asked softly. "You heard what Robert said about Targaryen blood. You saw how he looked at me. If Father speaks of it in King's Landing, if anyone else begins to suspect—" She didn't finish the thought, but Jon understood. The royal visit had changed everything, stripping away the comfortable illusions that had protected them both throughout their childhood. They were no longer simply bastards playing at being part of a great house. They were dangerous secrets that could destroy everyone they loved. The first sign that Winterfell's careful order was beginning to unravel came 3 days after Ned's departure, when 8-year-old Bran fell from the broken tower while climbing, despite repeated warnings about its dangerous state. The accident sent shockwaves through the household, transforming the great castle from a place of ordered routine into a chaos of fear and desperate activity. Maester Luwin worked tirelessly over the unconscious boy, but the head injury was severe, and for days it remained unclear whether Bran would survive. Catelyn refused to leave her son's side, maintaining a vigil that stretched into sleepless nights and tearful days. The burden of managing Winterfell fell to 15-year-old Robb, who struggled to balance his duties as acting lord with his own fear for his brother's life. It was during this period of upheaval that Daena's carefully controlled abilities began to manifest in ways she couldn't suppress. The stress of isolation, combined with her growing awareness of the danger surrounding her, seemed to unlock something primal in her Targaryen blood. She found herself walking through Winterfell's corridors in the middle of the night, with no memory of leaving her bed, drawn by dreams of fire and flight that felt more like memories than fantasies. The first incident occurred on the 5th night of Bran's coma. Daena woke to find herself standing in the castle's great hall, barefoot on the cold stone, with the massive hearth blazing so fiercely that the entire chamber was lit as bright as day. The fire roared with an intensity that should have consumed all the wood in Winterfell, yet the fuel seemed untouched, as if the flames were feeding on something else entirely. "My lady," the voice belonged to one of the night guards, a grizzled man-at-arms who had served House Stark for 20 years. His weathered face was pale with shock as he stared at the impossible sight before him. "What? How did—" Daena looked from the man to the fire and felt her heart sink. There was no explaining this, no way to dismiss what he had witnessed as anything normal or natural. The flames danced higher at her presence, responding to her emotions with an eagerness that terrified her. "I couldn't sleep," she said weakly, knowing how inadequate the explanation sounded. "I came down for some warm milk and found the fire like this." The guard nodded slowly, but Daena could see in his eyes that he didn't believe her. Word would spread, servants talked, and mysterious fires in the middle of the night were exactly the kind of story that would grow with each telling. By morning, half of Winterfell would be whispering about the bastard girl and her unnatural relationship with flame. The second incident was worse, because it involved Catelyn directly. Daena had been attempting to help with Bran's care, bringing water and fresh linens to the sick room where Catelyn maintained her endless vigil. The sight of the boy lying so still and pale had awakened something protective and desperate in Daena's nature. This was her brother in all the ways that mattered, and she couldn't bear to watch him suffer when she possessed abilities that might help. "My lady," she said quietly as she entered the chamber, "perhaps you should rest. Let me sit with Bran for a while." Catelyn looked up from where she sat beside the bed, and Daena was shocked by the change in the woman who had been her reluctant mother for 14 years. The Lady of Winterfell looked haggard and hollow, her auburn hair unwashed, and her usually immaculate appearance dishevelled with grief. "He won't wake up," Catelyn said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maester Luwin says the swelling in his brain. If it doesn't subside soon—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Daena understood. Bran was dying, and conventional medicine could do nothing to save him. "May I?" Daena asked, gesturing toward the boy. Catelyn nodded absently, lost in her own despair, and Daena approached the bed where her brother lay unconscious. She placed her hands gently on either side of Bran's head, feeling for the warmth that had helped heal him years ago when he was injured as a toddler. This time, the power that flowed from her was stronger, more focused, a golden heat that seemed to seek out the damaged tissue and encourage healing. Bran's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Daena thought he might wake, but the effort was too much, too visible, and when she looked up, she found Catelyn staring at her with undisguised horror. "What are you doing?" Catelyn's voice was sharp with fear and revulsion. "What is that? That glow around your hands?" Daena tried to pull away, but Catelyn grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, staring at the faint luminescence that still danced around Dana's fingers like captured starlight. "This is not natural," Catelyn whispered, and there was something in her voice that was close to panic. "This is not human. What are you?" Before Dana could answer, the door burst open, and a hooded figure stumbled into the room, an assassin with a cruel blade in his hand and murder in his eyes. He had come for Bran, to finish what the Fall had started, but found instead 2 women and a target who was no longer alone. "No," Dana said, and the word came out with such force that the very air seemed to ignite. The fire that erupted from her hands was not the controlled healing warmth she had been using moments before. It was pure dragon fire, white-hot and devastating. The assassin barely had time to scream before the flames consumed him, reducing him to ash in seconds while leaving everything else in the room untouched. The silence that followed was deafening. Catelyn stared at the small pile of ash where a man had stood moments before, then at Dana, who stood with her hand still glowing with residual heat and her violet eyes blazing with an inner fire that no human gaze should hold. "You're one of them," Catelyn breathed, and the words carried the weight of 14 years of suspicion finally confirmed. "You're a Targaryen. A dragon." Dana wanted to deny it, wanted to find some explanation that would restore the careful balance that had protected her for so long. But the evidence was undeniable, and the fear in Catelyn's eyes made it clear that their relationship had fundamentally changed in ways that could never be repaired. "My lady, Get out," Catelyn said quietly, but her voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Get out of this room. Get out of my sight. And if you ever use that abomination again under my roof, I'll see you burned as the monster you are." Dana fled, her heart breaking with each step that took her further from the family she had thought was hers. But even as she ran through Winterfell's corridors, she could hear Catelyn behind her, calling for guards, demanding that Maester Luwin be summoned, taking the first steps toward making Dana's existence in the castle impossible. She found Jon in the armory, methodically cleaning his sword with the focused attention he brought to all his tasks. He looked up as she entered, and the expression on her face told him immediately that something terrible had happened. "They know," Dana said simply. "Catelyn knows what I am." Jon set down his sword and moved to her side, his presence a steady comfort in the chaos that was consuming her world. "Tell me what happened." As Dana related the events in Bran's chamber, she watched Jon's face grow grave with understanding. They both knew that Catelyn's discovery changed everything. There could be no more pretending, no more hiding in plain sight. The secret that had protected Dana for 14 years was finally broken. "I have to leave," Dana said when she finished her account. "Tonight, before she can send word to anyone else." "Where will you go?" Jon asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "North," Dana replied. "Beyond the wall. It's the only place in the world where Targaryen blood doesn't matter, where dragons are just stories and fire magic might be seen as a gift rather than a curse." Jon was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed equally dangerous. Finally, he looked at her with the intensity that marked his most important decisions. "I was planning to take the Black anyway," he said. "Uncle Benjen has been telling me for years that the Night's Watch needs good men. And with Father gone, and Robb as heir, there's no place for me here. I'll go to Castle Black, and when the time is right, I'll find you." "Jon, you can't." "I can," he said firmly, "and I will. You're my sister, Dana. You're my family. Whatever else happens, whatever you are or where you have to go, that doesn't change." That night, as Winterfell slept uneasily under the growing shadow of winter, a raven arrived from King's Landing, bearing Ned Stark's seal. The message was brief but urgent. Circumstances require immediate caution. Trust no one outside family. Further instructions to follow. But the warning came too late. By dawn, Dana Snow had vanished from Winterfell like morning mist, leaving behind only a carefully written note expressing gratitude for the family that had raised her, and regret for the danger her presence had brought upon them. She took little, some food, warm clothing, a few pieces of silver, and the small dagger that Jon had given her years ago, with the promise that she would always know how to defend herself. But most importantly, she carried with her the knowledge of what she truly was, and the growing certainty that hiding from her nature was no longer possible. The last daughter of House Targaryen was finally ready to embrace the dragon's fire that burned in her blood, even if it meant walking alone into the frozen wilderness beyond the edge of the world. Behind her, Winterfell woke to discover that one of its own had disappeared into the northern darkness, carrying secrets that could shake the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. And in the days that followed, as word of her flight spread, those who had suspected the truth began to whisper the name that had been hidden for so long: Daenerys Stormborn, the dragon princess who had been hiding in plain sight for 14 years. The Game of Thrones had claimed its first casualty, and the pieces were beginning to move in patterns that would reshape the realm forever. Chapter 7. Flight of the Dragon. The northern wilderness in deepest winter was a realm of white death, where the cold could kill a man in minutes, and the wind carried voices that belonged to no living thing. For 3 days, Daenerys Targaryen, who had been Dana Snow until the moment she fled Winterfell, travelled through this frozen wasteland with only her stolen supplies and the fire that burned in her dragon's blood to keep her alive. Behind her, she could hear them coming. The pursuit had begun at dawn on the second day, when Robert's men arrived at Winterfell with orders that chilled Catelyn Stark's blood more than the winter wind. They had come seeking Targaryen bastards and dragon spawn that may have been hiding among the noble houses of the north. The timing of their arrival, so soon after Dana's disappearance, suggested that someone in King's Landing had grown suspicious enough to act on their fears. "Search everywhere," the captain had commanded, his southern accent harsh against the northern air. "The king wants every silver-haired bastard brought to him alive. There's 1,000 gold dragons for the one that lights fires without flint." But Dana had too great a head start, and she possessed advantages that her pursuers couldn't anticipate. Where their horses foundered in the deep snow, her dragon's blood kept her warm enough to continue on foot. Where they needed to stop and build fires to survive the night, she could create flames with a thought, warming herself without revealing her position with smoke or light. Still, she knew they would catch her eventually. Men with horses, supplies, and knowledge of the terrain would always overtake a single girl fleeing on foot. Her only hope lay in reaching the wall before they reached her, in finding Jon and the protection that Castle Black might offer. The wall, when it finally appeared through the swirling snow, was more magnificent and terrible than any of old Nan's stories had prepared her for. 700 feet of ancient ice rose into the grey sky like a frozen waterfall, and along its base sprawled the black buildings of Castle Black, the fortress that had guarded the realm for thousands of years against the dangers that lurked beyond. Dana approached the gates with the caution of someone who understood that her very presence could mean death for everyone she cared about. She had no way of knowing if the pursuit had sent ravens ahead, no way of knowing if the men of the Night's Watch would see her as a refugee to be protected or a threat to be eliminated. "Hold!" called the guard at the gate, a grizzled man in black whose weathered face spoke of decades spent fighting against the cold and darkness. "State your name and business." "I seek Jon Snow," Dana said, pulling back her hood to reveal the silver-gold hair that marked her as unmistakably other. "I'm his sister." The guard's eyes widened as he took in her appearance, and Dana could see him making rapid calculations about what her presence might mean. But before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the winter air. "Dana." Jon Snow appeared in the gateway like an answer to her prayers, though the black cloak of the Night's Watch that hung from his shoulders reminded her that even this refuge came with a price. At 14, he had grown lean and hard in the week since leaving Winterfell, but his grey eyes still held the warmth and protective loyalty that had defined their relationship since childhood. "What are you doing here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "You should be at Winterfell with people who want to see me burned as a monster," Dana interrupted quietly. "Jon, Robert's men are coming. They're looking for Targaryens, and Catelyn, she knows what I am. I had to run." Jon's face went pale with understanding, and Dana could see him weighing the implications of her presence. The Night's Watch was sworn to neutrality, but harboring a fugitive Targaryen was the kind of political entanglement that could destroy the order. "How long until they arrive?" he asked. "Hours, maybe less. They have horses and dogs, and they're following my trail." Dana looked around the courtyard of Castle Black, taking in the black-clad men who moved about their duties with the efficient purpose of soldiers. "Jon, I can't stay here. My being here puts everyone in danger." "Then we go beyond the wall," Jon said, with the decisive certainty that had always marked his most important decisions. "Tonight, before they arrive." "Jon, you can't." "I can," he said firmly, "and I will. You're my sister, and I won't let them take you." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of an elderly figure wrapped in the black robes of a Maester. Maester Aemon moved slowly, his age and blindness requiring careful steps on the icy ground, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he navigated toward them. "Bring her inside," the old man said without preamble. "Quickly, before more eyes see what they shouldn't." Jon helped guide Dana into the Maester's chambers, where Aemon settled into his chair beside a carefully tended fire. For a long moment, the blind Maester simply sat in silence, his ancient face turned toward Dana with an attention that seemed to see far more than his clouded eyes should allow. 84 years, Aemon said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. For 84 years, I have served the Night's Watch and kept my vows, but I never thought I would live to meet another of my blood. Dana felt her breath catch in her throat. You know what I am. I know what you are because I am the same, Aemon replied, and in his voice was the weight of a secret carried for nearly a century. I am Aemon Targaryen, son of Maekar, brother to King Aegon the Unlikely. I was offered a crown once, child, but I chose the wall instead. I chose to serve rather than to rule. The revelation hit Dana like a physical blow. Here, in the last place she would have expected it, was family, true family, connected to her by blood and shared heritage. The old man before her carried the same dragon fire that burned in her veins, had struggled with the same burden of power and responsibility that now fell to her. I felt you the moment you approached the wall, Aemon continued. The blood calls to blood, and ours burns hotter than most. Tell me, child, can you command fire? Dana nodded, not trusting her voice. And dragons come to you in dreams? Again she nodded. Then you are indeed what I suspected, the last daughter of my grand-nephew Aerys. The realm believes you dead, child. It would be best if that belief remained unchallenged. "That's what I'm trying to do," Dana said, finding her voice at last. "But they're hunting me. Robert's men know I exist, and they won't stop until they find me." Aemon was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him as he considered options that all carried terrible risks. Finally, he spoke with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime making impossible decisions. "The wall has protected those who seek refuge for thousands of years," he said. "But you cannot take vows, and even if you could, your presence here would eventually be discovered. There is only one place in the world where Targaryen blood means nothing, where fire magic might be seen as a blessing rather than a curse." "Beyond the wall," Jon said, understanding immediately. "Beyond the wall," Aemon confirmed. "Among the free folk, strength is what matters. Power is respected, regardless of its source. If you can survive the journey, if you can prove yourself to them, you might find a place where you can live without fear." "I'll go with her," Jon said immediately. "She can't make that journey alone." Aemon turned his blind gaze toward Jon, and Dana could see the old master weighing the cost of what Jon was offering. "You would break your vows? Desert the night's watch for her sake?" "She's my sister," Jon replied simply. "Family comes before vows. Even vows sworn before gods?" Jon hesitated only a moment. Even then, the sound of horses in the courtyard interrupted their conversation, and Dana felt her heart sink as she recognized the voices of the men who had been pursuing her. They had arrived, and there was no longer time for careful planning. "The crypts," Aemon said urgently. "There are passages beneath Castle Black that lead to the northern side of the wall. Old smugglers' routes from the days when the Watch was less scrupulous about enforcing the law." Jon moved immediately to gather supplies, food, weapons, warm clothing, everything they would need for a journey into the true north. But as they prepared to flee, Aemon caught Dana's hand with his ancient fingers. "Listen to me, child," he said urgently. "You carry more than just your own destiny. The blood of kings runs in your veins, but more than that, you carry the power to change the world. For good or for ill. In the lands beyond the wall, that power will be tested in ways you cannot imagine. Remember who you choose to be, not what your blood demands of you." The old maester pressed something small and hard into her palm, a piece of jewelry that felt warm against her skin. "This belonged to your ancestor, Queen Visenya. It has been in my possession since I came to the wall. Perhaps it will serve you better than it served me." Dana looked down at the pendant, a small dragon carved from what looked like obsidian, its eyes tiny chips of red stone. The moment her fingers closed around it, she felt a responding warmth from something deep within herself, as if the dragon in her blood recognized an old friend. "Thank you," she whispered, but Aemon was already moving, urging them toward a concealed door that led to passages she had never known existed. The journey through the underground tunnels was a nightmare of ice and darkness, but it brought them to the far side of the wall, just as Dana heard the dogs beginning to bay behind them. Her scent had been found, and the pursuit would resume within hours. "This way," Jon said, leading her into the wilderness beyond the wall with the confidence of someone who had studied every map and listened to every ranger's tale. "Uncle Benjen told me about the paths the wildlings use. If we can reach the haunted forest, we might be able to lose them." As they moved deeper into the lands beyond the wall, Dana felt the change in the very air around them. This was a place where different rules applied, where the neat categories of the Seven Kingdoms meant nothing. Here, survival was the only law, and power, regardless of its source, was the only currency that mattered. It was in this alien landscape that they encountered their first wildlings. The hunting party found them on their second day beyond the wall, emerging from the snow-covered trees like ghosts made flesh. They were hard men and women, dressed in furs and leather, their faces marked by the scars and weather-beaten lines that came from a lifetime of fighting against a land that wanted them dead. "Crows," spat their leader, a woman with grey-streaked hair and eyes like chips of ice. "What are two crows doing this far from their wall?" "We're not crows," Jon said carefully, though he kept his hand near his sword. "We seek passage to speak with Mance Rayder." The woman laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. "Every crow who crosses the wall seeks Mance. Most of them are spies, sent to learn our plans and report back to their masters. Give me one reason why we shouldn't kill you where you stand." Dana stepped forward, and as she did, she let a little of the fire that burned within her show in her eyes. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The wildlings stepped back, as if they had been struck, their hands moving to weapons while their faces showed the kind of recognition that came from old stories and older fears. "Because," Dana said quietly, "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, and the blood of dragons runs in my veins. I seek allies, not enemies." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moaning through the trees. Then, slowly, the wildling leader smiled, an expression that was equal parts respect and anticipation. "Well then," she said, her voice carrying a new note of interest. "That changes things considerably. Mance will definitely want to meet you, Dragon Girl. He's been waiting his whole life for something like this." As the wildling party led them deeper into the true north, Dana felt the last connections to her old life finally snapping like frozen chains. Dana Snow, bastard daughter of Winterfell, was truly dead. What remained was Daenerys Targaryen, the last dragon, walking into a land where her fire might finally find a purpose worthy of its power. Behind them, far to the south, Robert's men found only cold trails and empty passages. The dragon princess had vanished into the white wilderness as if she had never existed, leaving behind only questions and fears that would haunt the Seven Kingdoms for years to come. But in the lands beyond the wall, where the old powers still held sway and magic flowed as freely as blood, the true game was only beginning. Chapter 8. Among the Free Folk. The wildling camp that sprawled across the frozen valley looked like something from the ancient stories, a city of tents and hide shelters that moved with the seasons, following the herds and the weather in patterns older than written history. Smoke rose from countless fires, and the air rang with voices speaking the old tongue, a language that sounded like winter wind given form. To Daenerys Targaryen, who had spent 14 years learning the careful courtesies of civilization, it was as alien as the surface of the moon. "Welcome to the real world, Crow," said Tormund Giantsbane, the massive wildling who had claimed them as prisoners 3 days earlier. His red beard was shot through with grey, and his blue eyes held the kind of humour that came from a lifetime of surviving things that should have killed him. "Down here, your wall means nothing. Your lords mean nothing. Only strength matters, and the will to use it." Tormund had not been gentle in his testing of that strength. For the past 3 days, he had pushed both Jon and Daenerys through trials that would have broken lesser people, forced marches through knee-deep snow, wrestling matches with wildlings twice their size, and survival challenges that required wit as much as endurance. Jon had adapted with the grim determination that marked all his endeavors, but Daenerys had surprised everyone by not merely surviving, but thriving under the harsh conditions. "The dragon girl has fire in her blood," Tormund had observed to his lieutenants, after watching Daenerys defeat a wildling woman in single combat, despite being half her opponent's size. Look at her eyes, purple as twilight and twice as dangerous. This one was born for the real North. Now, as they approached the massive tent that served as Mance Rayder's hall, Daenerys felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Word of her identity had spread through the camp like wildfire. The last daughter of the Dragon Kings, fled from the south and seeking sanctuary among the free folk. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with suspicion, but all watched her with the careful attention given to something that might prove either very dangerous or very useful. Mance Rayder's tent was larger than some houses Daenerys had known, its interior hung with furs and lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the leather walls. The king beyond the wall sat on a throne made from the bones of some great beast, but there was nothing pretentious about his bearing. He looked like what he was, a man who had earned his position through strength and cunning rather than birthright. "So," Mance said, his dark eyes studying the two young southerners who stood before him, "the Night's Watch has sent us gifts, a bastard crow and a dragon princess. Tell me, girl, why should I believe you are what your escort claims?" Daenerys stepped forward, and as she did, she let some of the fire that burned within her show in her eyes and voice. "Because, your grace, I have no reason to lie. I am Daenerys of House Targaryen, daughter of King Aerys, and I have fled the south because staying meant death." "Daughter of the Mad King," Mance mused, and there was no judgment in his voice, merely statement of fact. "The man who burned lords alive for pleasure. Tell me, girl, did you inherit his madness along with his fire?" "I inherited his blood," Daenerys replied steadily. "What I do with it is my choice." Mance smiled at that, and Daenerys could see approval in his expression. Spoken like one of the free folk. Down here, we judge people by their actions, not their ancestors. But words are wind, as we say. If you want to stay among us, you'll need to prove you belong. The trials that followed were unlike anything Daenerys had experienced in her careful education at Winterfell. The wildlings tested her in ways that had nothing to do with courtly graces or book learning. They wanted to know if she could hunt, if she could fight, if she could endure the kind of hardships that killed the weak and strengthened the strong. She exceeded their expectations at every turn. When challenged to track a wounded elk through a blizzard, she followed its trail for 12 hours across terrain that would have defeated most rangers. When forced to fight 3 wildling warriors simultaneously, she moved with a fluid grace that spoke of instincts older than training, weaving between their attacks like smoke given form. But it was during the fire trial that she truly proved what she was. "Every free folk knows the old ways," explained Ygritte, the red-haired wildling woman who had become Daenerys's unofficial guide. "Fire is life, and life is sacred. To join our people, you must show that the flames accept you." The trial involved walking across a bed of coals that had been burning for 3 days, hot enough to melt bronze and turn bone to ash. Wildlings who attempted the trial typically ran across as quickly as possible, accepting burns as the price of proving their courage. But when Daenerys stepped onto the glowing coals, something extraordinary happened. The fire didn't burn her. It welcomed her. She walked slowly across the burning path, her bare feet stepping confidently on coals that should have reduced her to screaming agony. But instead of pain, she felt only a warm embrace, as if the flames were old friends greeting her return. The gathered wildlings watched in stunned silence as she reached the far end of the coal bed, her skin unmarked, her silver-gold hair shining in the firelight like a crown. "Dragon blood," Tormund whispered, and in his voice was the kind of awe usually reserved for legends. "True dragon blood, like the old stories tell." Word of Daenerys's trial spread through the wildling host like a grass fire, and within hours she had acquired a new name among the free folk, the Red Queen, for the way the flames had seemed to bow before her passage. But more than reputation, the trial had unlocked something deeper in her nature, a connection to the primal forces that shaped the world beyond the wall. It was 3 nights later, during a ritual meant to call down the ancient spirits for guidance, that Daenerys first successfully summoned something that had been extinct south of the wall for 300 years. The ritual took place in a circle of standing stones older than memory, with the wildling shamans chanting in voices that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the earth. Daenerys knelt in the center of the circle, her hands pressed against the frozen ground, feeling for the currents of power that the wise women claimed flowed through all things. "Call to the old powers," urged Osha, the grey-haired shaman who led the ceremony. "Let the fire in your blood speak to the fire that sleeps beneath the ice." Daenerys closed her eyes and reached deeper into herself than she had ever dared before, past the careful control she had learned at Winterfell, past the fear that had kept her hidden for so many years. She touched the molten core of her Targaryen heritage and let it pour forth into the world. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire erupted from the ground around her, but it was not the orange and red flames of normal combustion. It burned white and blue and silver, with colors that had no names in mortal languages. And in the heart of that impossible fire, something began to take shape. It was small at first, no larger than a sparrow, but it grew with each moment until it stretched 15 feet from nose to tail. Scales like midnight caught the firelight and threw it back in shades of deep blue and purple. Wings that seemed to be cut from the northern sky itself spread wide as the creature lifted its magnificent head and looked directly at its summoner with eyes like captured stars. An ice dragon, the first to be seen in the world for 1,000 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Every wildling in the circle stared at the impossible sight before them, their faces showing the kind of religious awe that came from witnessing the return of myth to the world. Even the shamans, who had spent their lives trafficking with spirits and ancient powers, seemed stunned by what Daenerys had accomplished. "How?" Jon whispered, his grey eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. "How is that possible?" "I don't know," Daenerys replied honestly, though she could feel the connection between herself and the magnificent creature that coiled around her like a cat seeking warmth. "I called, and it answered." The dragon, for that's what it was, despite its ethereal nature, seemed to be made of ice and starlight rather than flesh and bone. When Daenerys reached out to touch its snout, her fingers passed through scales that felt like frozen silk, solid enough to support her touch, but clearly not entirely of this world. "It won't last," Osha said, her voice filled with professional analysis rather than wonder. "The magic that made it is powerful, but unstable. Creatures like this need anchor points in the physical world, eggs, bones, something to give them permanent form." As if summoned by her words, Tormund appeared at the edge of the circle, his massive arms carrying something that made Daenerys' heart race with possibility. They were eggs, 3 of them, each the size of a man's head, and colored like captured winter storms. Their surfaces showed patterns of silver and blue that seemed to shift in the firelight, and when Daenerys looked at them, she could swear she felt something stirring within. "Found them in a cave about 2 days' march north," Tormund explained, his usual boisterous manner subdued by the magnitude of what was happening. "Been there for gods know how long, frozen solid as stone. But when the lads brought them back tonight and set them by the fire, He gestured at the eggs, which were now visibly warm despite the freezing air. They started changing, getting warm, like there's life inside. Daenerys approached the eggs with the reverence she might have shown to holy relics, because in a sense, that's exactly what they were. Ice dragon eggs, preserved in the eternal winter, beyond the wall for longer than human memory could reach. And now, responding to the fire in her blood, they were beginning to wake. "May I?" she asked, though she was already reaching out to touch the nearest egg. The moment her skin made contact with the shell, the change was dramatic. Heat flowed from her hands into the ancient egg, and she could feel the life within responding to her call. The other eggs began to glow with their own inner light, and the ice dragon she had summoned earlier seemed to solidify, becoming more real with each passing moment. "3 dragons," Mance Rayder said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what this meant for the balance of power in the world. The first dragons born beyond the wall, since the long night itself. As the night wore on and the eggs continued to warm under Daenerys' touch, the wildlings gathered around the fire began to speak in hushed tones about prophecies and ancient songs. They spoke of the Red Queen who would come from the south, bringing fire to the eternal winter. They spoke of ice dragons that would herald the return of the old powers, and of a time when the wall itself would become irrelevant. But it was Jon who understood the personal implications most clearly. "You're changing," he said to Daenerys, as they sat apart from the celebrating wildlings, watching the dragon eggs pulse with increasing life. "Every day you're here, you become more. Yourself. More what you were always meant to be." Daenerys looked at him, seeing in his grey eyes the complex mixture of love, pride, and fear that had defined their relationship since childhood. "Does that frighten you?" "Yes," Jon admitted honestly. "But not because I think you'll become something evil, because I can see that you're becoming something magnificent, and I don't know if there will be a place for me in that future." The vulnerability in his voice made Daenerys' heart ache. For 14 years, Jon had been her constant companion, her protector, her family in every way that mattered. The thought of losing that connection, of growing beyond their shared history, was almost unbearable. "There will always be a place for you," she said, reaching out to take his hand. "Whatever I become, wherever this path leads me, you are my family. That will never change." But even as she spoke the words, they both knew that change was the one constant in their lives now. Daenerys was no longer the hidden bastard who had fled Winterfell. She was becoming the Dragon Queen that her blood demanded her to be, and that transformation would reshape everything around her. As if to emphasize the point, one of the dragon eggs cracked with a sound like breaking bells, and a tiny snout poked through the shell. The baby ice dragon that emerged was no larger than a kitten, but its eyes held the ancient wisdom of its kind, and when it looked at Daenerys, she knew that her life among the free folk had only just begun. The Red Queen had found her people, and the North would never be the same. Chapter 9. Ice and Fire. United. The raven that brought word of Eddard Stark's execution arrived at the wildling camp on a morning when the aurora danced green and gold across the northern sky. It was a fitting herald for news that would set the world ablaze, carrying tidings that transformed a refugee dragon princess into something far more dangerous, a queen with a cause worth burning for. Daenerys Targaryen, who had spent the past year among the free folk becoming the Red Queen of legend, read the message with hands that trembled not from cold, but from a fury so pure it seemed to set the parchment itself alight. 15 years old, and already a force that made grown warriors step back in awe, She had learned to command ice dragons and bend flame to her will, but nothing had prepared her for the volcanic rage that consumed her as she absorbed the terrible news from the south. "Father," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of 14 years of love and protection. Ned Stark had not sired her, but he had been her father in every way that mattered, the man who had sheltered her, taught her honor, and died because he possessed too much integrity for the games of kings and queens. The fire that erupted from her grief was unlike anything the free folk had ever witnessed. It rose from the frozen ground in a column of white-hot flame that reached toward the aurora itself, burning so fiercely that snow turned to steam for 100 yards in every direction. Her 3 ice dragons, now grown large as war horses, with scales like polished midnight and eyes like captured stars, circled the pillar of fire with cries that sounded like winter storms given voice. Jon Snow found her at the heart of the conflagration, untouched by flames that should have reduced her to ash, her silver-gold hair whipping in winds created by the intensity of her rage. At 15, he had grown tall and broad-shouldered, his face bearing the hard lines that came from a year beyond the wall. But looking at Daenerys in her fury, he still saw the girl who had once been his sister, now transformed into something that made the very air shimmer with power. "Dana!" he called, though he had to shout to be heard over the roar of magical fire. "Dana, you need to stop. The whole camp will burn." She turned toward him, and for a moment Jon wasn't sure she recognized him. Her violet eyes held depths of flame that seemed almost inhuman, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated with the ancient magics flowing through the world. "They killed him," she said, and each word fell like drops of molten silver. "They killed my father, Jon, the man who saved me, who raised me, who loved me despite knowing what I was. They took his head like he was some common criminal." The flames around her pulsed brighter with each word, responding to emotions too large for any mortal frame to contain. Jon stepped closer, feeling the heat wash over him like standing next to a forge, but driven by a loyalty that went deeper than fear. "I know," he said quietly. "I loved him too, but burning down the north won't bring him back." "No," Daenerys agreed, and slowly the fires began to bank, though her eyes still held their terrible light. "But it might avenge him, and it will certainly ensure that those who ordered his death understand the price of making enemies of dragons." Word of the Red Queen's rage spread through the wildling host like lightning, and by evening, Mance Rayder had called a gathering of all the clan leaders and war chiefs. They assembled in the great circle of standing stones where Daenerys had first summoned her dragons, drawn by rumors of southern war and the possibility of something they had never dared imagine. A chance to strike back at the wall and the lands beyond it with a power that could match their ancient enemies. "The crows tell us that war has come to the 7 kingdoms," Mance announced to the assembled leaders. "The wolf lords fight the lion lords, and blood flows in the south like a spring flood. Some might say this is none of our concern, that we should stay in our frozen lands and let the kneelers kill each other." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Mance raised his hand for silence. "But we have something among us now that changes everything," he continued, his gaze finding Daenerys where she stood with her 3 dragons coiled around her like living jewelry. "We have the Red Queen, the dragon daughter who commands ice and fire alike, and she has a debt to settle with those who wear crowns in the south." Daenerys stepped forward, and the gathered wildlings fell silent as her presence filled the circle with something that felt like the breath before lightning strikes. She had learned much about leadership in her year beyond the wall, lessons taught by necessity and sealed with dragon fire. Eddard Stark was Lord of Winterfell, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. He was also the man who saved my life when I was an infant, who raised me as his own daughter, despite the danger it brought to his family. 3 days ago, they took his head on the orders of a boy king who has never earned anything beyond the accident of his birth. The wildlings listened with the careful attention they gave to anything that might affect their survival. Among the free folk, debt was sacred, and blood demanded blood. "I could take my dragons and fly south alone," Daenerys continued. "I could rain fire on King's Landing until nothing remains but ash and memories. But that would be the action of a mad tyrant, and I refuse to become what my enemies claim I already am." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the circle, meeting the eyes of men and women who had spent their lives fighting against the constraints of civilization. "Instead, I offer you alliance. The Stark banners are rising in rebellion against the boy king and his Lannister puppeteers. Help me support that rebellion, and I promise you something no wildling has seen in 8,000 years, the chance to march south of the wall, not as raiders or refugees, but as allies of the North itself." The silence that followed was profound. For millennia, the free folk had been locked away beyond the wall, dismissed as savages and barbarians by the lords of Westeros. The idea that they might join a southern war as equals, as allies rather than enemies, was revolutionary enough to reshape the very foundations of their world. It was Tormund Giantsbane who broke the silence, his booming voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of what was being offered. "You're talking about changing everything," he said, "about making the wall meaningless, turning enemies into allies. The free folk don't kneel, Red Queen. We never have, and we never will." "I'm not asking you to kneel," Daenerys replied. "I'm asking you to fight alongside people who value honor and family above gold and crowns. I'm asking you to help me save the North from those who would see it burn for their own advancement." The debate that followed lasted through the night and into the dawn, with clan leaders arguing the merits and dangers of such an unprecedented alliance. But gradually, consensus began to emerge around the recognition that the Red Queen offered them something they had never possessed before: legitimate power in the affairs of the South. By the time the sun rose over the frozen landscape, the decision had been made. The free folk would march south, not as conquerors but as allies of House Stark and enemies of the Iron Throne. The preparations that followed transformed the wildling host into something unprecedented in the history of Westeros, a disciplined army capable of matching the trained forces of the South. Daenerys threw herself into the work with the intensity that marked everything she did, teaching wildling warriors the formations and tactics she had learned from Ser Rodrik at Winterfell, while Jon worked to organize their crude weapons and equipment into something resembling military order. "They're learning faster than I expected," Jon reported, after a week of intensive training. "Wildlings are natural fighters, and they understand the value of discipline when it's explained properly." "Good," Daenerys replied, watching as her dragons performed aerial maneuvers above the training grounds. They had grown large enough for her to ride now, their wingspans approaching those of the great eagles that hunted in the high mountains. "Send ravens to the mountain clans. Tell them the Red Queen calls for their aid. And reach out to the northern lords, the Umbers, the Karstarks, anyone still loyal to House Stark." The response to their overtures was swift and encouraging. The mountain clans, who had always maintained an uneasy independence from both wildling and Kneeler authority, sent representatives to treat with the Red Queen. Northern lords, desperate for any advantage in their war against the crown, proved surprisingly willing to overlook old prejudices in exchange for dragon fire and wildling steel. It was through these communications that Daenerys received word from Robb Stark himself, now calling himself king in the north in response to his father's murder. The letter that arrived bore the grey direwolf seal of House Stark, and its contents spoke to the desperation and determination of a young king fighting impossible odds. "Sister," the letter began, acknowledging their relationship despite its unconventional nature, "word has reached us of your presence beyond the wall, and of the power you command. If half the stories are true, you have become something out of legend, a dragon queen in the lands of eternal winter." Daenerys read the words with a mixture of joy and sorrow, remembering the boy who had been her older brother in all but blood. "We fight against enemies who murdered our father, and would see House Stark extinct," Robb continued. "I do not ask you to involve yourself in this war for my sake, but I hope the love you bore our father might move you to consider our cause. The North remembers, sister, and the North needs dragons." That night, Daenerys stood atop the highest peak for miles around. Her largest dragon, whom she had named Winterfell in honor of her childhood home, spread his great wings beneath her, as they soared through air so cold it would have killed anyone without dragon blood in their veins. From this height, she could see the wall as a thin line of pale stone dividing the world into north and south, civilized and wild, past and future. But more than geography, she could see possibility, the chance to forge something new from the ashes of the old world, to unite ice and fire in a cause greater than vengeance or conquest. "What do you see, my queen?" Jon asked when she landed, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "I see an army," Daenerys replied, gesturing toward the sprawling camp where wildlings and mountain clansmen prepared for a war unlike any in history. "I see the chance to save the North and perhaps change the world. And I see the beginning of something that will make the Game of Thrones look like children playing with toys." She turned to face him, her violet eyes holding depths of determination that made Jon's heart race with equal measures of pride and fear. "Tomorrow we march south," she said. "Tomorrow the Red Queen brings fire and ice to the lands that killed our father. And before we're done, everyone from Dawn to the Wall will know that House Stark is not so easily destroyed." As if in response to her words, her 3 dragons raised their voices in harmony, their cries echoing across the northern wilderness like a song of war and winter made manifest. The sound carried for miles, reaching the ears of every living thing beyond the wall, and serving notice that the age of hiding was over. The Dragon Queen had found her cause, and the 7 kingdoms would never be the same. Chapter 10. The dragon marches south. The sight of 40,000 wildlings crossing the wall would have been enough to send panic through every castle from Winterfell to King's Landing. But when those same wildlings marched beneath banners, bearing the grey direwolf of Stark, and were led by a 16-year-old queen riding a dragon the colour of winter storms, the very foundations of the 7 kingdoms began to tremble. Daenerys Targaryen, now called the Snow Dragon, by friend and foe alike, sat astride Winterfell, the largest of her 3 ice dragons, as her unprecedented army flowed through the ancient tunnel beneath the wall like a river of steel and fur. The sight defied every expectation, every assumption about how the world was supposed to work. Wildlings and kneelers marching together, ice and fire united under a banner that proclaimed loyalty to the North, while following a dragon queen who had been dead in the histories for 16 years. "Look at them," Jon Snow said, riding beside his sister on a destrier bred for war beyond the wall. At 16, he had grown into a leader who commanded respect through deed rather than birth, his face bearing the weathered lines of someone who had seen too much death too young. The greatest army the North has seen since the days of the kings of winter. Daenerys looked down at the forces spreading across the landscape below, wildling spear wives marching alongside mountain clansmen, Stark loyalists fighting beside warriors who had raided their villages for generations. It was an alliance that should have been impossible, held together by nothing more than shared hatred for those who had murdered the most honorable man in Westeros. "Father would have been proud," she said quietly, though her voice carried the steel that had made her a queen among the free folk. He always said the North was strongest when it stood united. Their first test came sooner than expected. The Battle of Last Hearth erupted on a grey morning when Lannister forces, reinforced by sellswords and Frey cavalry, tried to intercept the Northern army before it could link up with Robb Stark's main force. Lord Commander Tallheart had been tasked with holding the line until reinforcements could arrive, but what he got instead was a lesson in why dragons had conquered the Seven Kingdoms 300 years earlier. The battle lasted less than an hour. Daenerys led the charge personally, all three of her dragons screaming through the morning sky like winter given wings. Winterfell, her largest mount, breathed ice fire that froze men solid before shattering them like glass sculptures. Storm, her most aggressive dragon, tore through cavalry formations with claws like icicles and teeth like frozen daggers, and Ice, the smallest but fastest of her children, darted between enemy ranks, spreading panic wherever her shadow passed. But it was what happened after the battle that truly established the legend of the Snow Dragon. As Lannister soldiers threw down their weapons in surrender, Daenerys faced the kind of choice that defined rulers: mercy or vengeance, justice or expedience. The sellswords had fought for gold and could be dismissed or even recruited. The Frey cavalry had followed orders from their treacherous lord. But the Lannister officers, they had come north to finish what the Crown had started when they took Ned Stark's head. "Your Grace," said Sir Galbert Glover, one of the northern lords who had joined her cause, "what shall we do with the prisoners?" Daenerys dismounted from Winterfell, her dragon folding his great wings as she approached the kneeling captives. Among them was Sir Amory Lorch, the knight who had murdered Princess Rhaenys during the sack of King's Landing, a crime that had gone unpunished for 16 years. "You know who I am?" she asked the man, her violet eyes holding depths of dragonfire. Lorch's face went pale as understanding dawned. "The Targaryen girl. But you're supposed to be." "Dead?" Daenerys finished for him. "Yes. Everyone seems surprised by that." "Tell me, Sir Amory, do you remember Princess Rhaenys?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "I remember her," Daenerys continued, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the battlefield. "A little girl, barely older than a baby, murdered in her bed by a man who thought slaughtering children would win him favor with a new king. That man stands before me now, expecting mercy he never showed to innocents." The dragon fire that consumed Sir Amory Lorch was swift and final, but its message resonated across the north and beyond. The Snow Dragon was not merely a conqueror. She was a force of justice, long delayed, and she possessed both the power and the will to settle debts that others thought forgotten. Word of the victory at Last Hearth spread like wildfire, bringing castle after castle back into the Stark fold. The Umbers declared for King Robb and the Snow Dragon. The Karstarks, who had wavered in their loyalty, sent riders to pledge their swords. Even houses that had bent the knee to the Iron Throne began sending secret messages expressing their true allegiance. But it was the liberation of Winterfell that truly tested Daenerys' heart. The ancient seat of House Stark had fallen to Theon Greyjoy's treachery months earlier. its walls held by iron-born raiders while its rightful lords fought in the south. When Daenerys' army approached the castle where she had spent her childhood, she could see the kraken banners flying where the direwolf should have been, and the sight filled her with a rage as cold and implacable as her dragon's breath. "I want them taken alive," she commanded, as her forces surrounded Winterfell. "Theon Greyjoy is mine." The siege lasted 3 days, not because the Ironborn fought particularly well, but because Daenerys refused to use dragonfire against the castle itself. Every stone of Winterfell was sacred to her, every tower a repository of memories that had shaped her into who she was. Better to lose 100 men than damage the place that had been her true home. When the gates finally opened, it was not to surrender, but to reunion. Bran Stark, now 10 years old and walking with the aid of carved crutches, emerged from the castle with young Rickon at his side. Behind them came Maester Luwin, Old Nan, and a handful of servants who had remained loyal despite the Ironborn occupation. The sight of her brothers, alive, safe, standing in the courtyard where she had once played as a child, broke something loose in Daenerys' chest that she had been holding tight for 2 years. "Dana?" Bran asked, uncertainty in his voice as he looked at the silver-haired queen who claimed to be his sister. "Is it really you?" Instead of answering, Daenerys knelt in the snow and opened her arms. Bran and Rickon ran to her, their joy unrestrained and infectious, and for a moment she was not the Snow Dragon, or the Red Queen, or the last Targaryen princess. She was simply the sister who had come home. "I promised I would find you," she whispered, holding them close as her dragons circled overhead like protective spirits. "I promised I would come back." It was Jon who brought her the captured Theon Greyjoy, dragging the Ironborn prince before her throne. The same Iron Throne they had brought south from beyond the wall, carved from the bones of great beasts and crowned with ice. Theon looked nothing like the confident young man who had been her foster brother. Months of holding Winterfell against growing resentment had worn him down to someone who jumped at shadows and flinched from loud noises. "Theon," Daenerys said, her voice carrying the weight of childhood memories and present judgment. "You took my home. You threatened my brothers. You betrayed the family that raised you." "I did what I had to do," Theon replied, though his voice shook. "For my father. For my real family." "Your real family," Daenerys interrupted, standing from her throne with the fluid grace that marked all her movements. "Was Ned Stark not a father to you? Were Robb and Jon not your brothers? Was I not your sister?" She gestured toward Bran and Rickon, who watched the proceedings with the wide-eyed attention of children learning about justice. "Look at them, Theon. Look at what you threatened when you took this castle. Look at what you nearly destroyed." The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then Daenerys spoke again, and her words carried a mercy that surprised everyone present. "You will live," she said simply. "You will live with what you've done, and you will serve House Stark for the rest of your days in whatever capacity they see fit. Your life is forfeit. But I return it to you as a gift. Use it to make amends for what you took." The gesture sent ripples throughout her army and beyond. The Snow Dragon possessed not only the power to destroy, but the wisdom to know when destruction was not the answer. It was a display of royal judgment that even her enemies had to acknowledge. The strategic meeting at the Twins, where Robb Stark's army was to link up with the wildling host, should have been the culmination of their campaign, the moment when the divided forces of the North reunited to march on King's Landing. Instead, it became the stage for treachery that would have changed the course of the war. But Walder Frey had not counted on dragons. The Red Wedding was meant to be a trap, a feast that would end with the death of the king in the north and the destruction of Stark power forever. Lord Frey had made his bargains with Tywin Lannister, his plans laid out with the meticulous attention to detail that marked a lifetime of nursing grudges. The musicians were really crossbowmen, the doors were meant to be barred, and the slaughter was scheduled to begin the moment the feast reached its height. What actually happened was rather different. Daenerys entered the feast hall riding Storm, her middle dragon, through the great windows in an explosion of ice and starlight. The sight of a dragon in the confined space of the hall sent immediate panic through the assembled guests, but it was the riders who came through the shattered windows after her that turned panic into terror. Jon Snow and Tormund Giantsbane led wildling warriors through every opening, while the sound of battle erupted from outside as the rest of the army dealt with Frey soldiers. "Lord Walder," Daenerys said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos, as Storm settled in the center of the hall with wings spread wide, "you seem to have prepared quite a feast. I hope you don't mind that I brought my own entertainment." The old man, who had thought himself so clever, looked up at the Dragon Queen with the expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had just turned to ash in his mouth. "You cannot prove," he began, but Daenerys cut him off with a gesture. "I don't need to prove anything," she said. "I am not a judge in a court of law. I am a Dragon Queen cleaning house." The fire that consumed Walder Frey was neither quick nor merciful. It burned with the accumulated fury of every betrayal, every broken oath, every moment of treachery that had brought the North to its knees. And when the flames finally died, the message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. The time of easy betrayal was over. That night, as the combined armies of the North celebrated their reunion and mourned their near disaster, Daenerys stood with Robb Stark on the walls of the twins and looked south toward the remaining enemies of their house. "We could have lost everything tonight," Robb said, his young face bearing the weight of kingship and the relief of survival, "if you hadn't come when you did." "But I did come," Daenerys replied, watching her dragons patrol the night sky like circling constellations. "And now we march together, ice and fire, wolf and dragon, the North united, as it hasn't been in thousands of years." "What comes next?" Robb asked. Daenerys smiled, and in that expression was the promise of justice, long delayed, and vengeance finally within reach. "Now we go to King's Landing," she said, "and we show the Iron Throne what happens when you murder a Stark." The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The North had dragons now, and the South would learn to fear the winter wind. Chapter 11. The Iron Throne. Burns. The siege of King's Landing began at dawn on the first day of spring in the year 300 AC, when the largest army Westeros had seen since Aegon's conquest spread across the fields outside the capital like a tide of steel and dragon fire. From the walls of the Red Keep, Queen Cersei Lannister looked out at banners she had thought buried forever. The grey direwolf of Stark, flying alongside the three-headed dragon of Targaryen, surrounded by the clan signs of wildlings and mountain lords who had never knelt to any southern king. But it was not the sight of armies that struck fear into the hearts of those who defended the capital. It was the three dragons that circled the city like harbingers of a new age. Winterfell, the largest, had grown to rival Balerion, the Black Dread in size and majesty, his scales the color of winter storms, and his breath capable of turning stone to ice in moments. Storm and Ice, his smaller but equally deadly siblings, wove patterns in the sky that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of mere beasts. And riding Winterfell, her silver-gold hair streaming like a banner in the wind, was the young woman who had been thought dead for 16 years. Daenerys Stormborn, last daughter of House Targaryen, come home to reclaim what had been stolen from her family. "Open the gates," Daenerys called from Dragonback, her voice magically amplified to carry across the entire city. "Surrender now, and I promise mercy to all who lay down their arms. Continue this futile resistance, and learn why my ancestors conquered 7 kingdoms with fire and blood." The response came not in words, but in the form of scorpion bolts launched from the walls, massive ballista projectiles designed to bring down dragons. But these were not the dragons of 300 years past, weakened by generations of confinement and inbreeding. These were creatures born of ice and ancient magic, and the bolts that should have pierced their hearts passed through their ethereal forms like mist. Cersei Lannister watched the failed attack from the throne room, her green eyes bright with the desperate fury of someone who saw everything she had built crumbling to ash. Beside her stood Jaime, his golden hand gleaming in the light from the windows, his face bearing the weight of someone who understood that they faced not just an army, but a force of nature. "The wildfire," Cersei said suddenly, her voice carrying the sharp edge of inspiration, born from desperation. King Aerys had caches of wildfire placed throughout the city. If we can't defeat the Dragon Queen, we can at least ensure she inherits nothing but ashes. Jaime's face went pale. "Cersei, there are 500,000 people in this city. You're talking about murdering everyone in King's Landing to spite one girl." "That girl is not just anyone," Cersei snapped. "She's the daughter of the Maud King, come to finish what her father started. And I will not let her have the Iron Throne." The wildfire gambit began as the sun reached its zenith, with explosions blooming like green flowers throughout the city. But what Cersei had intended as a trap for the attacking army became something far more terrible. A test of character for the Dragon Queen herself. Daenerys saw the first explosion from Dragonback, a pillar of emerald flame that consumed an entire district in moments. She felt her dragon's rage building in response, sensed their desire to answer fire with fire, to burn the city until nothing remained but glass and memory. And for one terrible moment, she was tempted to let them. This was the city that had cheered when her infant nephew was murdered. This was the place where her father had been overthrown and her family slaughtered like animals. Every street held the memory of Targaryen blood spilled on Lannister orders, and it would be so easy to let that blood debt be paid in full. But then she saw the faces below, small folk running in terror from flames they had no part in creating, children crying for parents who would never come home, common soldiers who fought not from loyalty to Cersei, but from simple duty to their posts. These were not the people who had wronged her family. They were innocents caught in a game played by others. "No," she said, and the word carried the force of absolute command. "Not like this." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary display of magic the world had ever witnessed. Instead of adding her dragon's fire to the inferno consuming the city, Daenerys turned their power against the wildfire itself. Ice flame met emerald destruction in aerial battles that lit the sky like aurora, as her dragons literally froze the alchemical fires out of existence. It was exhausting work that pushed both rider and mounts to their limits, but gradually the green flames were extinguished, leaving behind districts that were frozen rather than burned, crystalline structures of ice where there should have been ash. The message was clear. The Dragon Queen possessed not just the power to destroy, but the will to protect. The real confrontation came when Daenerys finally breached the Red Keep, her dragons clearing a path through the ancient fortress until she stood before the Iron Throne itself. The massive seat of power, forged from 1,000 enemy swords by the first Targaryen conqueror, seemed smaller than she had imagined, less a symbol of ultimate authority than a crude monument to the violence that had built the realm. Cersei Lannister knelt before the throne, her hands bound, but her eyes still blazing with defiance. Beside her, Jaime stood unrestrained, a calculated mercy that acknowledged his complex history and the role he had played in preventing greater catastrophe. "So," Cersei said, her voice carrying the bitter satisfaction of someone who had nothing left to lose. "The last dragon has come home. Tell me, Your Grace, do you plan to be a better queen than your father was a king?" Before Daenerys could answer, the great doors of the throne room crashed open, admitting figures that made her blood run cold with shock and recognition. At the head of a small group of men in Pentoshi silks walked someone she had thought dead for 16 years. Her brother Viserys, alive and bearing the unmistakable signs of madness that had claimed their father. He had grown into a pale shadow of what he might have been, his silver hair lank and unwashed, his violet eyes bright with the fervor of someone who had spent years nursing grievances that had grown into obsessions. Behind him came sellswords and Pentoshi dignitaries, men who had clearly been financing his return in hopes of gaining influence with a restored Targaryen monarchy. "Sister," Viserys said, and in his voice was all the entitled fury of someone who had been denied what he considered rightfully his. "How touching. The little girl has grown up to play with dragons and wildling savages. But playtime is over. It's time for the rightful king to reclaim his throne." The reunion Daenerys had dreamed of as a child had become a nightmare. This broken man was not the brother she had mourned, but a stranger wearing a familiar face, twisted by years of exile and the same madness that had destroyed their father. "Viserys," she said carefully, noting how his hand rested on the pommel of a sword that gleamed with an oily sheen that suggested poison. "I thought you were dead. I grieved for you." "Grieved?" Viserys laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "You grieved while you lived in comfort with the Starks, playing at being their beloved daughter. You grieved while I suffered in exile, begging for scraps from Pentoshi merchants and Lyseni slavers. But I survived, sister. I survived and planned and gathered power, and now I've come to claim what was promised to me." "The throne belongs to the strongest," Daenerys replied, her dragons moving to flank her, as the tension in the room built toward violence. "That is how our ancestor Aegon claimed it, and how it has passed ever since." "Strength?" Viserys drew his poisoned blade with the quick motion of someone who had trained for this moment for years. "You think commanding a few overgrown lizards makes you strong? I am the rightful heir, the last male of our line. By law and custom, the crown is mine." The duel that followed was brief and terrible. Viserys had trained with some skill during his exile, but he was fighting someone who had learned warfare among the wildlings, who had been tested in real battle against enemies who showed no mercy. More than that, he was fighting someone who commanded powers he could barely comprehend. When Viserys lunged with his poisoned blade, aiming for what should have been a killing blow, he found his weapon melting in his hand. Not from heat, but from the absolute cold that Daenerys could summon at will. The shock and terror in his eyes, as his carefully laid plans crumbled, was almost pitiable. "You always were weak, brother," Daenerys said, as ice spread up Viserys' arm from where he had touched the supernaturally cold metal. "Father's madness, but none of his fire." The dragon fire that consumed Viserys was neither cruel nor drawn out. It was simply final. When the flames died, nothing remained of the last male Targaryen but ash, and the memory of paths not taken. With her brother's death, the last connection to the old dynasty, was severed. Daenerys stood before the Iron Throne as its undisputed claimant, the sole surviving heir to 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The moment she had been born for, the destiny written in her blood, lay before her, requiring only that she step forward and claim it. Instead, she drew her sword. The blade that had been forged beyond the wall from star metal and dragon's breath struck the Iron Throne with a sound like thunder, and where it touched, the ancient metal began to crack. Again and again she struck, each blow powered by dragonfire and fury, until the symbol of absolute monarchy began to crumble. "What are you doing?" Cersei gasped, staring in shock as centuries of power were literally broken apart before her eyes. "I'm ending this," Daenerys replied, stepping back as the last piece of the Iron Throne crashed to the floor. No more absolute kings, no more dynasties ruling by right of conquest alone. The realm needs something new, something better. Jon Snow, who had watched the destruction in silence, finally stepped forward. "What do you propose instead?" Daenerys looked around the throne room, at the ruins of the Iron Throne, at the shocked faces of lords and ladies who had built their entire lives around the concept of absolute monarchy, at the dragons who represented power enough to rule the world. "A great council," she said finally. "Representatives from every region, every major house, chosen by those they serve rather than by birth alone. Let the realm be governed by wisdom and consensus rather than the whims of kings who inherit power they never earned." The proposal was revolutionary, flying in the face of everything the 7 kingdoms had believed about governance for 300 years. But looking around the ruined throne room, at the evidence of what absolute power had cost the realm, even the most traditional lords found themselves considering the possibility that there might be a better way. "And you?" Jon asked quietly. "What role would you take in this new realm?" Daenerys smiled, and in that expression was the peace of someone who had finally found their true purpose. Protector, perhaps. Guardian. Someone to ensure that the old mistakes are not repeated, that power never again becomes concentrated in the hands of those who would abuse it. As the sun set over King's Landing, the age of kings came to an end. The last dragon had claimed her birthright only to transform it into something entirely new, proving that true strength lay not in the ability to rule, but in the wisdom to know when ruling was not the answer. The Iron Throne was dead, but from its ashes rose the possibility of something better, a realm where power served the people rather than the reverse, protected by dragons, but not dominated by them. The Game of Thrones was over. The game of building a better world had only just begun. Chapter 12. A New Spring. The Great Council that convened in the spring of 300 AC was unlike any gathering in the history of Westeros. Where once the Iron Throne had stood, a circular chamber had been built within the Red Keep, its design inspired by the stone circles where wildling clans had made decisions for thousands of years. Representatives from every region sat as equals, lords and commons alike, chosen not by birth but by the trust of those they served. Daenerys Targaryen, 16 years old and already a legend, stood before the assembled council with the quiet confidence of someone who had remade the world through will and wisdom rather than fire and blood. Her 3 dragons perched on specially constructed roosts around the chamber, their presence a reminder of the power that protected this new experiment in governance. But their peaceful demeanor showed that power's purpose had fundamentally changed. "My lords and ladies, representatives all," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "we gather not to crown another king or queen, but to begin something the Seven Kingdoms have never attempted: rule by consensus rather than conquest. The proposal had been months in the making, refined through countless discussions with advisors both northern and southern, wildling and highborn. The Great Council would serve as the realm's primary governing body, with each region selecting representatives based on their own traditions. The North would hold to its ancient moots, the Reach would choose through its guild systems, and even the wildling clans would send speakers chosen by strength and wisdom. "But who will lead this council?" asked Lord Randil Tarley, his skepticism evident, despite his grudging respect for the Dragon Queen, who had spared his life. "Without a king, without clear authority, how do we prevent chaos?" "With this," Jon Snow replied, stepping forward to stand beside Daenerys. At 16, he had grown into the role of diplomat and strategist, his stark honor serving as a bridge between the old world and the new. A protectorate, not a monarchy. Power shared between positions that serve different functions, each held accountable to this council. The framework they proposed was revolutionary. Daenerys would serve as protector of the realm, responsible for external threats and the dragons that guarded against invasion or rebellion. Jon, formally legitimized as Jon Stark and offered the crown of an independent North, had chosen instead to serve as Lord Commander of the Great Council, managing the day-to-day governance that kept the realm functioning. "And if the Protector abuses her power?" asked Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns having survived the conquest through shrewd surrender and genuine admiration for Daenerys' revolutionary approach. "Dragons have overthrown kings before. What stops them from doing so again?" Daenerys smiled at the question, appreciating its directness. "This does," she replied, gesturing to a document that had been distributed to every representative. "The Compact of Westeros, which limits the Protector's authority and establishes the Council's right to remove anyone who betrays the trust placed in them. Even dragons can be voted out of office." The establishment of the new government took weeks of debate and negotiation, with each region's unique concerns addressed and accommodated. The Riverlands, devastated by years of war, would receive priority in reconstruction efforts. The Iron Islands would be allowed to maintain their traditional way of life in exchange for ending their raiding. Even the wildling clans found themselves welcomed as equal partners in the realm, their ancient wisdom about surviving harsh conditions proving invaluable as the long winter finally began to break. But it was the personal ceremonies that truly marked the transition from old world to new. The wedding of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Stark took place in a godswood that had been transplanted to King's Landing, ancient weirwoods uprooted from beyond the wall and replanted in the heart of the capital. The ceremony followed northern traditions, with bride and groom speaking their vows before the heart tree, while representatives from every corner of the realm looked on. "I am yours and you are mine," Daenerys said, her violet eyes meeting Jon's grey ones as they knelt together in the soft earth. "From this day until the end of my days." "From this day until the end of my days," Jon repeated. And in those ancient words was the promise that their union represented something larger than romance, a joining of ice and fire, north and south, old ways and new possibilities. The feast that followed was a celebration unlike any King's Landing had ever seen. Wildling war chiefs drank alongside Dornish princes, Stark soldiers shared stories with former Lannister bannermen, and the great hall rang with laughter instead of the political scheming that had once poisoned every gathering. But the true work of reconstruction was only beginning. Bran Stark, now 11 years old and displaying abilities that went far beyond his years, had been tasked with establishing a communication network that would link the far corners of the realm. Using methods that combined ravens, signal fires, and something deeper that he called the site, he created a system that allowed the Great Council to stay in contact with even the most remote regions. The old way was for the capital to send orders and expect obedience, Bran explained to the assembled representatives during one of the council's first major sessions. This way, we listen before we act. Every voice in the realm can be heard before decisions are made. Sansa Stark, now 14, and showing the political acumen that marked the best of her bloodline, had taken charge of rebuilding the Riverlands. Her approach combined northern practicality with the diplomatic skills she had learned during her captivity in King's Landing, creating policies that addressed both immediate needs and long-term stability. People need to eat before they can worry about politics, she told the council during her first report. We've established granaries in every major town, work programs that give people purpose while rebuilding what was destroyed, and trade agreements that bring prosperity instead of just survival. Arya Stark's return from her wanderings brought a different kind of contribution to the new realm. At 11, she was already displaying the skills that would make her invaluable as the Great Council's primary intelligence coordinator. Not a spy master in the traditional sense, but someone who could move unseen through all levels of society and report on the real concerns of common folk. The old way was to spy on people to control them, Arya reported during one of her briefings to the inner council. I propose we listen to them to serve them. There's a difference between surveillance and understanding. The integration of wildling culture into the broader realm proved one of the most successful aspects of the new order. Their traditions of consensus decision-making, gender equality, and respect for individual strength, regardless of birth, provided models that other regions began adopting. The wall itself was transformed from a barrier into a gateway, with regular trade and cultural exchange flowing both directions. Most importantly, the dragons ceased to be weapons of conquest and became symbols of protection. Daenerys established aerial patrols that watched for external threats while carefully avoiding the internal politics of the realm. When pirates threatened the shipping lanes or mountain bandits grew too bold, dragon intervention was swift and decisive. But the creatures never appeared during political debates or council votes, a clear signal that the age of ruling through fear was over. The years that followed brought prosperity the realm had never known. With the resources once spent on endless wars redirected toward infrastructure and education, trade flourished between regions that had been enemies for centuries. The elimination of feudal obligations in favor of negotiated agreements meant that common folk could pursue their own interests while still contributing to the greater good. 10 years after the Great Council's first session, Daenerys Targaryen stood in the Godswood of King's Landing, watching her 5-year-old daughter practice her letters under the watchful eye of Maester Samwell Tarly. The child, born Lyanna Stark in honor of the aunt Jon had never known, possessed her mother's silver-gold hair and her father's grey eyes, a perfect blend of ice and fire that seemed to symbolize everything the new realm had become. "Tell me again about the old days, Mama," Lyanna asked, looking up from her slate with the bright curiosity of a child born into peace. About the kings and queens who sat on iron chairs. Daenerys settled beside her daughter on the soft grass, marveling at how different this conversation was from the ones she had shared with Ned Stark in this same setting so many years ago, where once they had spoken of hidden truths and dangerous secrets. Now she could share history openly and honestly. "Once upon a time," she began, using the formula that had become their tradition, "there was a great chair made of swords, and whoever sat in it could command everyone in all the 7 kingdoms to do whatever they wanted." "That sounds scary," Lyanna said, with the wisdom of a child who had never known fear of arbitrary authority. "It was scary, Daenerys agreed, because having that much power over other people makes even good people do bad things. So your father and I decided to break the chair and let everyone share the power instead. Like how the council makes decisions. Exactly like that. Everyone gets to speak, everyone gets to vote, and the dragons make sure no one tries to take all the power for themselves again. Lyanna considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Will I be a dragon rider someday? The question was one Daenerys had been expecting. Winterfell and his mates had produced a clutch of eggs the previous spring, and one of them had begun responding to Lyanna's presence with the kind of interest that suggested a future bond. If the dragons choose you, Daenerys replied carefully, and if you choose them. But remember, being chosen by a dragon doesn't make you special, it makes you responsible. Dragons are guardians, not weapons. They exist to protect the realm, not to rule it. I know, Lyanna said, with the confidence of a child who had grown up seeing dragons used only for protection and rescue. Papa says the stark words are, "Winter is coming," but Uncle Bran says we've changed them. Oh? What are they now? Spring has come, Lyanna announced proudly, because the long winter is over and everything grows again. As if summoned by their conversation, Jon appeared through the trees, his face bearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just finished a productive day's work. At 26, he had grown into the role of Lord Commander with natural grace, his combination of northern honor and diplomatic skill making him an ideal leader for the diverse council. How went the session? Daenerys asked, rising to greet him with the comfortable intimacy of a decade's partnership. Better than expected, Jon replied, accepting her embrace while smiling down at their daughter. The Dornish proposal for expanded trade routes passed unanimously, and the Iron Islands have agreed to joint patrols with the Royal Navy. Even Lord Tarly admitted that democracy seems to be working. Any word from beyond the wall? Tormund sends his regards and a reminder that the spring hunt begins next week. He wants to know if the Dragon Queen is still soft enough to miss every shot. Daenerys laughed, remembering the friendly rivalry that had developed over the years between herself and the wildling leader. Tell him the Dragon Queen has been practicing, and this year she's bringing reinforcements. As the sun set over King's Landing, the family walked back toward the Red Keep together, their path lit by torches that no longer seemed ominous but welcoming. In the distance, dragons wheeled through the twilight sky, not as harbingers of conquest, but as guardians of a peace that had lasted a decade and showed no signs of ending. The reign of kings was over. The age of democracy, protected by dragons but guided by wisdom, had begun. And in the Godswood, where she had once learned dangerous truths about her heritage, Daenerys Targaryen now shared hopeful stories with a daughter who would inherit a world where power served the people rather than the reverse. The last dragon had become the first protector, and the realm was stronger for the transformation. Spring had indeed come to Westeros, and it had come to stay. In the distance, a new dragon egg began to crack, heralding the birth of guardians for a generation that would never know the tyranny of absolute power. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, and protected by the wisdom of those who had learned that true strength lay not in the ability to rule, but in the courage to serve. The story that had begun with a hidden princess fleeing in the night had become a legend of transformation and hope. Proof that even the most powerful bloodlines could choose to break the cycles that bound them and create something entirely new. The Age of Dragons was not ending. It was evolving, just as the realm itself had evolved from a collection of kingdoms ruled by fear into a unified nation governed by consent. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all.